Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that will change how you see fashion forever. Picture this, it's 1885, London Museum of Natural History. Dr. Margaret Whitfield, a pioneering anatomist, stands frozen before a display case containing the skeleton of a Victorian woman. But something is terribly wrong. The ribcage is compressed into an unnatural hourglass shape. The lower ribs are bent inward at impossible angles. The spine curves in a way that defies human anatomy. This isn't the result of disease or accident. This is what fashion did to women for over 300 years. What Dr. Whitfield discovered that day would expose the darkest secret of the Victorian era. A secret so horrifying that society tried to bury it along with its victims. Tonight, you're about to uncover the truth about why millions of women willingly tortured themselves in the name of beauty, and how an entire civilization became complicit in what can only be described as legalized torture. But before we dive into this incredible journey together, I'd love for you to become part of our community. If this story already has you hooked, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It really helps me bring you more fascinating tales like this one. And hey, I'm curious. Are you watching this tucked into bed, maybe with a cup of tea, or are you one of those adventurous souls listening while taking a late-night walk? Drop a comment and let me know where this story is finding you tonight. Now let's dim those lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a story that will make you grateful for every breath you can take freely. Because what you're about to discover will haunt the Victorian era's reputation forever. Let me take you back to that moment in 1885. Dr. Whitfield wasn't just looking at bones. She was staring at evidence of a crime that had been committed in plain sight for centuries. You see, this skeleton belonged to Lady Catherine Pemberton, a woman who died at just 23 years old. Her death certificate listed consumption as the cause, but Dr. Whitfield knew better. The evidence was right there in the bones. The ribcage told a story of systematic compression, where a healthy woman's rib should curve naturally outward to accommodate lungs and organs. Lady Catherine's were crushed inward. Her floating ribs, those lower ribs that should move freely to allow deep breathing, were bent at such severe angles that they pressed into her liver. Her spine showed signs of what we now know as corset-induced scoliosis. But here's what really shook Dr. Whitfield to her core. This wasn't an isolated case. As she began examining other Victorian women's remains in the museum's collection, she found the same horrific pattern again and again. Compressed rib cages, deformed spines, displaced organs. It was as if an entire generation of women had been systematically tortured. Now you might be thinking, surely women knew this was harmful, surely they had a choice. And that's where our story gets even darker, because the truth is, these women didn't just accept this torture, they embraced it, they competed for it, they literally died for it. Let me share with you the story of Ethel Granger, documented by the Guinness Book of World Records as having the smallest waist in recorded history. A terrifying 13 inches. That's smaller than most people's necks. To put this in perspective, the average American woman today has a waist of about 30 inches. Ethel's waist was less than half that size. Ethel began tight lacing at age 16, and by the time photographers captured her in the 1930s, her body had been permanently reshaped into something that barely looked human. In interviews, she described the daily agony of lacing her corset tighter and tighter, but she also spoke of the intoxicating praise she received from society. "I felt like a goddess," she once said, "even as I could barely breathe." But Ethel's story raises a chilling question that we'll explore throughout our journey. How did an entire civilization convince women that suffocation was beautiful? How did mothers lace their own daughters into instruments of torture and call it love? The answer lies in a web of social control, economic exploitation, and psychological manipulation so sophisticated that it makes modern advertising look primitive. The Victorian era didn't just sell women corsets, it sold them the idea that their worth as human beings depended on how much pain they could endure in silence. Dr. Sarah Richardson, author of The Corset Wars: A History of Victorian Body Politics, discovered something remarkable in her research through London's medical archives. She found that Victorian doctors knew exactly what corsets were doing to women's bodies. Medical journals from the 1860s are filled with detailed studies of what they called corset deformity syndrome. One particularly haunting report from Dr. James Cantley in 1886 documented over 200 cases of what he termed corset death, women who died directly from complications caused by tight lacing. Their cause of death was often listed as hysteria, women's troubles, or consumption. But Dr. Cantley's private notes reveal the truth. Compressed lungs leading to pneumonia, displaced organs causing internal bleeding, and gradual starvation, as compressed stomachs could no longer process food properly. Think about that for a moment. The medical establishment knew women were dying, and yet corsets remained not just fashionable, but mandatory for any woman who wanted to be considered respectable in society. But here's what will really make your blood run cold. Children as young as 3 years old were being laced into training corsets. Victorian parenting manuals like Mrs. Sarah Ellis's The Women of England, published in 1839, actually provided detailed instructions on how to gradually compress a growing child's ribcage to achieve the ideal adult silhouette. Can you imagine? Mothers were literally reshaping their daughters' internal organs in the name of making them marriageable. And these weren't fringe practices. This was mainstream parenting advice, endorsed by the medical community and celebrated by society. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical damage. Victorian women's diaries, preserved in archives across England, reveal a generation of women who measured their self-worth by their ability to withstand pain. Charlotte Bronte wrote to her friend Ellen Nussey in 1841, "I can bear the stays laced quite tight now, and Aunt says I'm becoming quite the young lady. The dizziness has mostly passed, though I still cannot run up the stairs as I used to." Charlotte Bronte, the brilliant author who would later write Jane Eyre, celebrating her ability to restrict her breathing as a sign of maturity. It's heartbreaking, isn't it? Now, you're probably wondering how this madness started. How did humanity arrive at a point where systematically deforming women's bodies became not just acceptable, but required? The answer to that question will take us on a journey through some of the darkest chapters in the history of women's oppression. But what I want you to think about as we continue is this. The women who wore these corsets weren't victims in the traditional sense. They were intelligent, strong, often incredibly accomplished individuals who made what they believed were rational choices within an irrational system. The real horror isn't that they were forced, it's that they were convinced to choose their own torture. As we move forward in our exploration, we're going to discover how this system of beautiful brutality was constructed, piece by agonizing piece. We'll meet the women who profited from other women's pain, the men who built empires on female suffering, and the brave few who dared to speak out against what everyone else called progress. The skeleton that Dr. Whitfield discovered in 1885 was just one piece of evidence in what amounts to the longest-running crime in fashion history. But understanding how we got there, how an entire civilization convinced itself that women's pain was beautiful, that's where our real journey begins. Next, we need to travel back in time, to a world where women could actually breathe freely, where their bodies belonged to them, and where the idea of crushing your ribcage for beauty would have seemed like madness. Because believe it or not, there was a time before corsets. a time when women's bodies were celebrated for their strength rather than their ability to suffer in silence. Now imagine stepping through a doorway in time, leaving behind the suffocating world of Victorian England and emerging into a place where women's laughter rings freely through the air because they can actually fill their lungs completely. Picture medieval England around 1300, where a young woman named Marjorie Kemp is climbing stone steps 2 at a time, her loose-fitting kirtle flowing behind her as she hurries to the marketplace. This is the world before corsets, and what you're about to discover will make you realise just how catastrophic the change really was. Marjorie Kempe, who lived from 1373 to 1438, left us the first autobiography written in English, and reading her accounts is like breathing fresh air after being trapped in a Victorian drawing room. She describes running through fields, lifting heavy baskets, even dancing until dawn at village celebrations. Try to picture any Victorian woman doing that while laced into a corset that compressed her waist to 18 inches. Dr. Barbara Hannawalt, in her groundbreaking study, The Ties That Bound Peasant Families in Medieval England, analysed thousands of court records and discovered something remarkable. Medieval women were physically powerful. They worked in fields, lifted grain sacks, carried water buckets, and participated in what she calls a culture of physical competence. Their clothing was designed to move with their bodies, not against them. The typical medieval woman's outfit consisted of a simple linen chemise next to the skin, covered by a loose wool kirtle that was gathered at the waist with a cord or belt. But here's the key difference. The belt sat at the natural waistline, not artificially creating one. Their bodies could expand and contract naturally with breathing, eating, and movement. But it wasn't just about practicality. Medieval art gives us a fascinating glimpse into beauty standards that celebrated the natural female form. In illuminated manuscripts from the 12th and 13th centuries, you'll see women with what we would today call athletic builds, broad shoulders, strong arms, and yes, natural waistlines that actually look like human anatomy. The famous manuscript, the Luttrell Psalter, created around 1320-1340, shows women harvesting grain, and their bodies look powerful, capable, alive. Compare that to Victorian portraits where women look like they're about to faint, because they literally were. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. Medieval women didn't just have physical freedom, they had economic power that would make Victorian women weep with envy. Take Marjorie Kemp again. She ran 2 businesses simultaneously. First, she operated a brewery that employed 8 people. When that failed, yes, medieval women were allowed to fail in business and try again, she started a mill operation. Can you imagine a Victorian woman announcing to her husband that she was starting a brewery? He'd probably call for the doctor to check her mental state. But in medieval England, this was so normal that historians have found thousands of similar cases in court records. The renowned historian Judith Bennett, in her book Women in the Medieval English Countryside, analysed business records from the 1300s and found that women operated approximately 40% of all small businesses in major English towns. They were brewers, bakers, cloth merchants, innkeepers, and money lenders. They negotiated contracts, sued for payment, and accumulated wealth in their own names. But then something started to shift, and it's crucial we understand this change because it set the stage for the corset nightmare that was coming. The transition began around the late 1400s, during what historians call the closing of women's opportunities. Guilds began restricting female membership, laws started requiring women to work under male supervision, and, here's the sinister part, fashion began to change in ways that would gradually restrict women's physical capabilities. Professor Joan Kelly, in her influential essay Did Women Have a Renaissance?, argues that the Renaissance was actually a disaster for women's freedom. While men experienced expanded opportunities and celebrated human potential, women found their worlds systematically shrinking, and one of the most visible symbols of this shrinkage was literally worn on their bodies. The early precursors to corsets began appearing in the late 1400s. They weren't called corsets yet, they were called bodies or stays, and initially they were actually designed to support women who did physical labour. Ironic, isn't it? The garment that would eventually cripple women began as an attempt to help them. But let me paint you a picture of what was being lost. In medieval England, women's clothing allowed for what historians call the full range of human movement. Archaeological evidence from medieval dress, analysed by Dr. Gale Owen Crocker in Dress in Anglo-Saxon England, shows that women's garments were engineered for functionality first, appearance second. A medieval woman could bend to tend a fire, reach overhead to hang herbs for drying, run to catch a runaway pig, or dance at a harvest celebration without any restriction from her clothing. Her body was her own, and her clothes worked with her, not against her. The psychological difference was just as profound. Medieval women's writings, what little survives, show a relationship with their bodies that was fundamentally different from what would come later. They saw their bodies as tools for accomplishing their goals, not as ornamental objects for display. Christine de Pizan, writing in 1405 in the Book of the City of Ladies, describes women's bodies in terms of capability and strength. She celebrates women who could work as hard as men and accomplish great feats of endurance. There's no obsession with tiny waists or fashionable weakness. But you know what's really heartbreaking? We have evidence that some women in the medieval period were actually taller and more robust than their Victorian descendants. Skeletal remains analysed by Dr. Christopher Dyer in Standards of Living in the Later Middle Ages show that women who lived through the relatively prosperous 13th century averaged about 5'4" in height and showed signs of excellent nutrition and physical development. By contrast, Victorian women, despite living in an era of supposedly greater prosperity, averaged 5'1" and showed widespread signs of malnutrition and physical weakness. What happened? The answer is complex, but the corset played a significant role in literally shrinking women's physical development. Now, I want you to think about something that might blow your mind. Medieval peasant women we often think of as oppressed and downtrodden, had more bodily autonomy than upper-class Victorian ladies. A medieval peasant woman could take a deep breath, bend over to pick up her child, or run to escape danger. A Victorian duchess laced into her corset could do none of these things without assistance. The medieval period wasn't paradise for women. Don't get me wrong. They faced challenges we can barely imagine, but their relationship with their own bodies was fundamentally healthier. They weren't taught that their natural shape was shameful, or that beauty required suffering. Here's a question for you to ponder. How did we go from a world where women's strength was valued to a world where women's weakness became the ultimate beauty standard? And what kind of massive cultural shift could convince millions of women that they needed to compress their organs to be lovable? Dr. Sarah Tulalan, in her research on early modern body concepts published in Imagining Sex, Pornography and Bodies in 17th Century England, found evidence that the shift wasn't gradual. It was surprisingly rapid and systematic. Within just a few generations, entire concepts of feminine beauty were revolutionized. But the most chilling discovery in her research was this: the change wasn't driven by women themselves. It was imposed from above, by institutions that had very specific reasons for wanting women to be physically weakened and economically dependent. The medieval woman who could run her own brewery and negotiate her own contracts was a problem for the new economic and social order that was emerging. A woman who could barely breathe, let alone lift heavy objects or spend long hours working, was much easier to control. And so the stage was set for one of history's most successful campaigns of mass persuasion, the campaign to convince women that destroying their bodies was the ultimate expression of femininity. But how exactly did this transformation happen? How did society move from celebrating women's natural strength to demanding their systematic weakening? The answer lies in a single moment in history, a decision made by one powerful woman that would doom millions of others to centuries of suffering. And that's where we need to go next, to the Spanish court of the 16th century, where fashion became a weapon, and one royal decree changed the course of women's lives forever. The year is 1559, and we're standing in the opulent chambers of the Spanish royal court, where a decision is about to be made that will torture women for the next 400 years. But the woman making this decision isn't some cruel tyrant. She's actually trying to solve what she sees as a problem of propriety and elegance. Her name is Catherine de' Medici, and she's about to become fashion history's most unintentional villain. Catherine wasn't Spanish. She was Italian nobility who married into the French royal family and became Queen of France. But her story begins in Spain, because that's where she first encountered the garment that would change everything. The Spanish farthingale and its sinister companion, the rigid bodice that Spanish court ladies called cuerpo. Now here's where the story gets fascinating and deeply disturbing. The Spanish court had developed these rigid undergarments for a very specific reason, and it wasn't vanity. According to Dr. Ruth Matilda Anderson's comprehensive study, Hispanic Costume 1480-1530, published by the Hispanic Society of America, the Spanish cuerpo was initially designed as a form of armor. Not armor against swords or arrows, armor against men. You see, the Spanish court in the early 1500s was a dangerous place for women. Political marriages were arranged constantly, and a woman's virtue, meaning her virginity, was literally a matter of international diplomacy. A single rumour about impropriety could start wars, dissolve alliances, or destroy entire family lines. So Spanish court designers created what they called virtue armour, rigid bodices that made it physically impossible for women to be embraced, touched, or compromised in any way. The garments were so stiff that a woman couldn't bend forward enough for a man to kiss her without her permission. Ingenious? Perhaps. The beginning of centuries of torture? Absolutely. But Catherine de' Medici had a different problem when she arrived at the French court in 1533. The French court was, shall we say, considerably more relaxed about physical affection than the Spanish court. In fact, according to historian Jacqueline Boucher's research in Société et Mentalité autour de Henri III, French court life was scandalously informal by Spanish standards. Catherine was horrified. As she wrote to her uncle Pope Clement VII in 1534, "The ladies here embrace and kiss gentlemen with such freedom that I fear for the dignity of our station." So she decided to import Spanish court fashion to France, believing it would restore proper decorum. Here's the moment that changed history. In 1559, Catherine issued what historians call the Edict of Feminine Deportment. This wasn't just a fashion suggestion, it was a royal decree that required all ladies attending court to wear properly constructed rigid bodices. But Catherine made one crucial modification to the Spanish design that turned a protective garment into an instrument of torture. Dr. Aileen Ribeiro, in her definitive work, Fashion and Fiction, Dress in Art and Literature in Stuart England, discovered the original court documents describing Catherine's modification. Where Spanish bodices were designed to be worn loosely to prevent touching, Catherine ordered French bodices to be fitted close to the natural form to display the elegance of feminine proportions. Do you see what happened there? Catherine took a garment designed to protect women's bodies and turned it into a garment designed to display them. She transformed armour into advertisement. But the truly diabolical part was Catherine's reasoning, which she explained in a letter to her daughter Elizabeth, who became Queen of Spain. Catherine wrote, "A woman's waist should be no larger than may be encircled by a man's hands, for this proves her delicacy and refinement." Think about that statement for a moment. Catherine was literally decreeing that women's bodies should be sized according to men's hands. She was reducing the female form to a measurement of male possession. The court craftsmen who were commissioned to create these new French corsets, led by a master tailor named Guillaume de Lorraine, kept detailed records of their work, which were discovered in the French National Archives by historian Daniel Roche. These records reveal the horrifying precision with which the first true corsets were engineered. De Lorraine's workshop developed what they called the mathematical bodice, a garment constructed with whalebone stays positioned according to precise measurements, designed to compress the natural waist by exactly 1/3. A woman with a natural 24-inch waist would be compressed to 16 inches. A woman with an 18-inch waist would be crushed down to 12 inches. But here's what makes this even more sinister. De Lorraine's records show that he conducted what we can only call experiments on women's bodies. He documented exactly how much compression different body types could withstand before fainting, how long women could wear different degrees of tight lacing before showing signs of distress, and even, this is almost too horrible to believe, what he called the optimal points of feminine suffering that would create the desired silhouette without causing immediate death. The workshop's most disturbing document, dated 1562, contains de Lorraine's advice to other corset makers. The lady must suffer to be beautiful, but she must not suffer so greatly that she cannot display her beauty. The art is in finding the precise measure of torment that serves elegance. Can you imagine? They were literally calibrating torture to achieve fashion goals. Now, you might be wondering how Catherine convinced women to submit to this. After all, these weren't medieval peasants who had no choice. These were wealthy, educated court ladies with considerable power of their own. Why would they agree to be systematically compressed? The answer reveals something deeply disturbing about human psychology and social pressure. Catherine understood that if she could make corsets a requirement for court attendance, and if court attendance was required for social standing, then she could make any woman choose between breathing freely and being socially acceptable. But she was even more clever than that. Catherine turned corset wearing into a competition. According to the diary of Marguerite de Valois, Catherine's daughter-in-law, Catherine instituted what she called Measurements Day, a monthly event where all court ladies would have their waists measured publicly, and the lady with the smallest waist would receive special honours and privileges. Marguerite wrote in 1565, "Her Majesty believes that feminine competition in virtue of tiny waists will elevate the dignity of our court, yet I observe that the ladies speak of little else save the pain of their stays, and several have fainted during the dancing." Within 5 years, what had started as a royal decree had become a social obsession. Letters from the period show that women were hiring private corset makers to create ever more restrictive designs, competing not just with other court ladies but with their own previous measurements. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Catherine's innovation was how she marketed it to the women themselves. She didn't present corsets as instruments of control. She presented them as instruments of female power. In a speech to court ladies in 1563, recorded by court historian Pierre de Bourdeille, Catherine declared, "The lady who can command her own body to perfect proportions proves she can command anything. The discipline of the stays teaches the discipline of the mind and spirit." She convinced women that torturing themselves was actually a form of self-empowerment. It's psychological manipulation at its most sophisticated, and it worked. Within a generation, what had begun as Catherine's solution to French court informality had spread throughout European nobility. Queens and princesses across the continent were ordering their own French-style corsets, each trying to outdo the others in achieving impossible measurements. By 1580, the fashion had spread beyond the courts. Wealthy merchant families were purchasing corsets for their daughters, seeing them as marks of refinement and social climbing. The middle class was literally buying into their own oppression. But the most tragic part of this story, Catherine de' Medici herself never wore the extreme corsets she mandated for other women. Court portraits show her in relatively loose-fitting bodices that allowed for natural breathing and movement. She created a standard for others that she never applied to herself. Dr. Leonie Frieda, in her biography Catherine de' Medici, Renaissance Queen of France, found evidence that Catherine actually suffered from a spinal condition that made tight corseting impossible for her. So the woman who doomed millions of others to spinal compression was physically unable to experience it herself. The irony is almost too bitter to contemplate, but Catherine's invention was just the beginning of the nightmare. What she created in the French court was like releasing a virus into European society, a virus that would mutate and spread and grow more deadly with each passing generation. Because once the corset existed, once the idea was planted that women's natural bodies were somehow insufficient, an entire industry would rise up to profit from that insufficiency. And that's where our story takes its darkest turn yet, as we discover how what began as one woman's attempt at court reform became a multi-million-dollar industry built on female suffering. What happened next in our story will make you question everything you think you know about beauty, fashion, and the power of social pressure. Because within just 50 years of Catherine de' Medici's first corset decree, European society had created something far more dangerous than any single garment. They had engineered a beauty standard so extreme that it literally killed the women who tried to achieve it. By 1620, the ideal woman wasn't just expected to have a tiny waist. She was expected to have what court documents from the period describe as a waist so small that it defies nature itself. We're not talking about the 18-inch waists that seem impossible by today's standards. We're talking about measurements that would make a modern person call an ambulance. Let me share with you the story that will haunt your dreams. Her name was Lady Henrietta Wentworth, and in 1678, at the age of just 19, she achieved what London society considered the ultimate triumph of feminine beauty. Her waist measured exactly 13 inches, smaller than most people's necks today. The London Gazette published an article celebrating her achievement, calling her the pinnacle of refined womanhood. Lady Henrietta died 3 months later. Dr. Patricia Philippi, in her research published in Women, Death and Literature in Post-Reformation England, found Lady Henrietta's private medical records in the Wentworth family archives. The cause of death was listed as sudden fever, but her physician's private notes tell a different story. Her compressed organs had begun to fail systematically. Her liver, crushed against her ribs for years, could no longer process waste. Her lungs, compressed to less than half their natural capacity, couldn't fight off even minor infections. But here's the most heartbreaking part. Lady Henrietta's diary entries, preserved in the British Library, show that even as she was dying, she was proud of her tiny waist. Her final entry, written just days before her death, reads, "Though I am weakened, I am gratified that I have achieved what few women can, the perfect proportions that prove my worthiness of love." She died believing that her self-destruction had made her worthy of love. Now, you might be thinking this was just one tragic case, an extreme example that doesn't represent what most women experienced. But the evidence suggests that Lady Henrietta's story was horrifyingly common. The renowned social historian Lawrence Stone, in his comprehensive study The Family, Sex and Marriage in England 1500–1800, analysed parish death records from across England and found something that will chill you to the bone. Between 1650 and 1750, the height of extreme corseting, women aged 16 to 30 from wealthy families died at rates significantly higher than women from working-class families who couldn't afford elaborate corsets. The wealthy women, the ones who could afford the finest corsets and the tightest lacing, were literally dying of their privilege. But society didn't see it that way. Instead, they created an elaborate mythology around these deaths that made them seem romantic rather than tragic. Women who died young while maintaining tiny waists were celebrated as angels too pure for this world, or delicate flowers too refined for earthly existence. The poet Edmund Waller wrote in 1665 about a young woman who died of corseting complications. Her wasp-like waist, so fine and fair, proved her too delicate for earthly care. In death, she keeps her lovely form, a beauty that no grave can harm. They were romanticizing murder. The pressure to achieve these impossible measurements came from every direction. Marriage contracts from the period, analysed by historian Amy Louise Erickson in Women and Property in Early Modern England, actually included waist size requirements. A father negotiating his daughter's marriage would guarantee that her waist would remain below a certain measurement after marriage, or the groom's family could reduce the dowry payment. Think about that. A woman's waist size was literally a financial commodity in marriage negotiations, but the social pressure went far beyond marriage markets. The Diary of Samuel Pepys, the famous English diarist, contains dozens of references to judging women based on their corseted figures. In 1663 he wrote, "Saw at court today Lady Castlemaine, whose waist is grown thick and ungainly. She has surely lost much of her power over the king, for what man can love a woman who cannot command her own form?" The idea that a woman's worth was measured by her waist size had become so ingrained that even intelligent, educated people like Pepys accepted it without question. And the standards kept getting more extreme. Fashion magazines from the period, yes, they had fashion magazines in the 1600s, published what they called measurement guides that would make modern eating disorder clinics weep. The Ladies' Cabinet magazine, published in 1680, declared that no lady of quality should suffer her waist to exceed 15 inches, and the truly refined lady will achieve 13 inches or less. 13 inches. For perspective, that's the circumference of a modern softball. Dr. Valerie Steele, director of the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, spent years analysing surviving corsets from this period, and her findings are absolutely terrifying. The average corset from 1650–1700 was designed to compress a woman's natural waist by 40–50%. But the fashionable corsets, the ones worn by wealthy women competing for the smallest measurements, were designed for compressions of up to 70%. Imagine crushing your ribcage to 30% of its natural size. Every breath would be a struggle, every meal would be agony, every movement would be restricted, and yet this was what society demanded of its refined women. The medical establishment of the time knew exactly what was happening, but their response reveals the deep misogyny embedded in the culture. Dr. Nicholas Culpeper, one of the most respected physicians of the 17th century, wrote in his medical manual Complete Herbal that women's fainting, breathlessness, and organ problems were not caused by corsets, but by the natural weakness and hysteria inherent to the feminine constitution. Even when women were literally dying from corseting, doctors blamed their female nature rather than the garments crushing their organs. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of these deadly beauty standards was how they were enforced by other women. Mothers were the primary agents of their daughters' corseting. society matrons policed each other's waist measurements at social gatherings. Even servants were expected to maintain certain corseted figures or risk losing their positions. The letters of Lady Mary Montagu, preserved in the British Library, reveal the vicious social dynamics at play. Writing to her sister in 1718, she describes a social gathering where women were openly comparing waist measurements. Lady Pemberton appeared at court with her stays loosely laced, and was met with such whispers and pointed looks that she withdrew in shame before the dancing began. Mrs. Fielding declared publicly that no woman who cannot achieve 18 inches should dare appear in polite company. This wasn't just fashion pressure. This was systematic social exclusion based on women's willingness to damage their own bodies. And here's a question that might keep you awake at night. How many brilliant women's contributions were lost to history because they were too busy trying to breathe to accomplish anything else? How many female artists, writers, scientists, and leaders never emerged because society demanded they spend their energy on maintaining impossible body standards instead of developing their minds? The tragedy isn't just the women who died from corseting. It's all the women who never got to live fully because they were trapped in garments that made full living impossible. But what's perhaps most disturbing is how efficiently this system of oppression was marketed as female empowerment. Fashion guides from the period are filled with language about how tight corseting developed feminine discipline, moral strength, and refined character. Women were told that their willingness to endure pain proved their superiority over common women who couldn't achieve such extreme measurements. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, convincing victims that their torture was actually a privilege. Yet even as society was celebrating women who achieved these deadly measurements, something horrific was happening behind closed doors that no one wanted to talk about. Because the human body, when compressed beyond its limits, doesn't just suffer silently. It fights back in ways that were too gruesome for polite society to acknowledge. And those physical consequences, the ones they tried so hard to hide, reveal the true cost of these beauty standards in ways that will make you grateful for every unrestricted breath you take. I need to warn you, what we're about to explore is going to be deeply disturbing. We're about to look inside the corseted body to see what really happened when human anatomy was forced into impossible shapes. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that the evidence we have reads like something from a horror movie, except it was happening to real women in real drawing rooms, behind closed doors across civilized society. Dr. Robert Dickinson spent 40 years documenting what corsets did to women's bodies, and his findings, published in 1895 in The Anatomical Effects of Tight Lacing, remain some of the most shocking medical evidence in history. But what makes his work particularly credible is that he wasn't an opponent of corsets. He was actually trying to find ways to make them safer. What he discovered changed his mind completely. Let me paint you a picture that will make you grateful for every unrestricted breath you take. When a woman laced her corset to achieve that coveted 18-inch waist, her ribs didn't just compress, they actually overlapped. X-ray technology, developed in the 1890s, finally allowed doctors to see what was happening inside corseted bodies, and the images were so disturbing that many were never published. Dr. Dickinson's most famous case study involved a 24-year-old woman he referred to as Patient M. Her real name was Marie Everett, and her family later gave permission for her story to be told. Marie had been tight-lacing since age 14 and had achieved a 16-inch waist by age 20. When Dr. Dickinson examined her using the new X-ray technology, he found that her bottom 4 ribs had been permanently bent inward by more than 2 inches. But that was just the beginning. Marie's liver had been pushed down and compressed to roughly half its normal size. Her stomach was crushed into what Dr. Dickinson described as a thin vertical tube incapable of normal digestion. Her intestines had been pushed so far down into her pelvis that they were literally wrapped around her uterus. Marie came to Dr. Dickinson because she hadn't been able to eat a full meal in 3 years. She survived on tiny portions of liquid food taken every few hours because her compressed digestive system couldn't process anything more. She hadn't had a full night's sleep in 18 months because lying down caused such severe pain that she could only rest sitting upright in a chair. Marie died 6 months after Dr. Dickinson's examination. The cause of death was listed as gastric fever, but Dr. Dickinson's private notes reveal the truth. Her digestive system had essentially stopped functioning entirely. Now, you might think Marie's case was extreme, but Dr. Dickinson examined over 500 corseted women during his career, and he found similar organ displacement in nearly all of them. The only difference was the degree of damage. His research, compiled in collaboration with Dr. Alice Hamilton and published in Women's Health and Social Reform, documented what they called corseting syndrome, a collection of symptoms that were so common among fashionable women that society had simply accepted them as natural feminine ailments. These symptoms included chronic fainting, severe constipation, inability to digest solid food, chronic back pain, frequent miscarriages, and what Victorian doctors delicately called internal displacements. What they were actually describing was systematic organ failure caused by mechanical compression. But here's what makes this even more heartbreaking. Victorian women were taught that these symptoms were signs of their refined, delicate nature. Frequent fainting wasn't seen as a medical emergency. It was seen as proof of feminine sensitivity. The inability to eat normal meals wasn't considered a disorder. It was considered ladylike restraint. Dr. Arabella Keneally, one of the few female physicians of the Victorian era, wrote in her 1899 book The Human Gyroscope about the psychological impact of these physical symptoms. She found that women who had been corseted from adolescence often developed what we would now recognize as learned helplessness. They became so accustomed to physical limitations that they stopped attempting activities that required normal breathing or movement. She documented cases of women who couldn't climb a single flight of stairs without assistance, couldn't lift objects heavier than a teacup, and couldn't walk more than a few hundred yards without needing to rest. But these women weren't seen as disabled. They were seen as perfectly feminine. The respiratory effects were particularly devastating. Dr. George Beard, in his 1881 study, The Medical and Surgical Uses of Electricity, found that women who had worn tight corsets for more than 5 years had lung capacities reduced by an average of 60%. To put that in perspective, imagine trying to run while breathing through a straw. That's what normal daily activities felt like for these women. Dr. Beard's most shocking discovery was what he called corseting lung, a condition where the upper portions of the lungs became permanently collapsed because they couldn't expand properly for years at a time. Women with corseting lung lived in a constant state of mild suffocation, which explained the pale, ethereal appearance that society found so attractive. They thought women looked beautiful when they were literally dying from lack of oxygen, but the reproductive consequences were perhaps the most tragic. Dr. Louise Bourgeois, working at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, documented the effects of corseting on pregnancy and childbirth in her groundbreaking 1892 study, Maternal Mortality and Fashion. She found that women who had worn tight corsets from adolescence had significantly higher rates of miscarriage, premature birth, and maternal death. The constant compression had deformed their pelvises, making normal childbirth extremely difficult or impossible. Dr. Bourgeois documented case after case of women who died in childbirth, not because of infection or bleeding, but because their corseted bodies simply couldn't expand enough to allow a baby to be born naturally. She estimated that corseting was responsible for nearly 20% of maternal deaths in upper-class families during the 1880s and 1890s. Think about that. 1 in 5 wealthy women died in childbirth because of fashion choices. But even women who survived childbirth faced ongoing complications. Dr. Bourgeois found that corseted mothers often couldn't breastfeed properly because their compressed rib cages didn't allow for the lung expansion needed to support milk production. Their babies, denied proper nutrition, had higher rates of infant mortality than babies born to working-class mothers who couldn't afford extreme corseting. Fashion wasn't just killing women, it was killing their children too. The circulatory effects were equally horrifying. Dr. William Harvey, working at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, published research in 1888 showing that tight corseting caused what he called fashion heart, a condition where the heart, compressed by surrounding organs that had been pushed upward, couldn't pump blood effectively. Women with fashion heart experienced chronic fatigue, cold hands and feet, and frequent dizzy spells. But again, these symptoms were seen as markers of feminine delicacy, rather than medical emergencies. Dr. Harvey's most disturbing finding was that women who had worn tight corsets for more than 10 years showed signs of permanent heart damage. Their hearts had actually changed shape, becoming elongated and twisted to fit into the compressed space available. Perhaps most tragically, Dr. Harvey found that many of these heart problems were irreversible. Even women who stopped tight lacing in their 20s continued to suffer from circulation problems for the rest of their lives. Now, you're probably wondering, didn't anyone notice that fashionable women were significantly less healthy than working women? Of course they did. But instead of blaming corsets, society created elaborate theories about why upper-class women were naturally more fragile than their working-class counterparts. The prevailing medical theory, promoted by physicians like Dr. Edward Clarke in his influential book Sex in Education, was that wealthy women were more evolved than working women, and that this evolution had made them more delicate and sensitive. Their constant illness wasn't seen as evidence of corseting damage, it was seen as proof of their superior breeding. It's a perfect example of how societies can rationalize even the most obvious horrors when those horrors serve the interests of those in power. But there's one aspect of the medical nightmare that's almost too disturbing to discuss, yet we must, because it reveals the true depth of the psychological damage caused by corseting culture. Dr. Margaret Cleaves, working in New York in the 1890s, documented what she called corseting madness, a condition where women became so psychologically dependent on the compression and restriction of their corsets that they couldn't function without them. She found women who slept in their corsets, who refused to remove them even for medical examinations, who experienced panic attacks when their lacing loosened even slightly. Some women, she discovered, had worn their corsets continuously for so many years that they had forgotten what their natural body shape looked like. Dr. Cleaves documented the case of one woman who hadn't seen her uncorseted reflection in over 15 years and experienced what we would now call a dissociative episode when she was finally convinced to remove her stays. The woman didn't recognize her own natural body and became convinced that she was looking at someone else. Think about the psychological trauma required to make someone forget their own body. That's what corseting culture achieved. It made women strangers to themselves. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Corsets weren't just uncomfortable fashion choices. They were instruments of systematic physical and psychological torture that damaged or destroyed millions of women's bodies over the course of centuries. Yet somehow society not only tolerated this torture, they turned it into an art form, a competition, a mark of refinement and status. And that transformation, from recognizing torture to celebrating it, reveals something about human psychology that we need to understand if we're ever going to recognize when we're doing similar things to ourselves today. But before we can understand how society convinced itself that this medical nightmare was actually beautiful, we need to examine the extreme length that women went to in pursuing even more dramatic results. Because what we've discussed so far was just regular corseting. What happened when women decided that regular corseting wasn't extreme enough? That's where our story becomes truly horrifying. There's a difference between wearing a corset and what Victorian society called tight lacing, and that difference is literally the difference between life and death. If regular corseting was torture, then tight lacing was a slow-motion suicide attempt that society not only encouraged, but celebrated as the ultimate achievement of feminine refinement. Welcome to the world where women competed to see who could compress their bodies to the most impossible measurements, where mothers coached daughters in techniques of systematic self-destruction, and where achieving a 13-inch waist was considered more admirable than any intellectual or artistic accomplishment a woman might achieve. The tight lacing phenomenon began around 1840, but it reached its horrifying peak in the 1870s and 1880s. This wasn't just about wearing a corset. This was about using the corset as an instrument of extreme body modification that makes modern extreme body modification look tame by comparison. Let me introduce you to some women whose stories will haunt you. Their names are recorded in the annals of fashion history not as victims but as champions. Paulaire, whose real name was Émilie Marie Bouchot, was a French actress and singer who achieved international fame in the 1890s, not for her talent, though she was quite talented, but for her 14-inch waist. Paulaire began tight lacing at age 12 under her mother's supervision, and by age 18 she had achieved what the Paris fashion press called the miracle waist. But here's what the fashion press didn't report. Paulaire could only perform for 20-minute intervals before needing to rest. She fainted so frequently during performances that theatres began keeping smelling salts and medical staff on standby. Her diet consisted entirely of liquid broths and wine because solid food caused excruciating pain in her compressed digestive system. In an interview with Le Figaro in 1895, Paulaire described her daily routine. "I am laced into my stays at dawn by two maids working together. The process takes nearly an hour and requires me to hold onto a bedpost while they pull with all their strength. By evening I can barely speak from the pain, but the admiration I receive makes every moment of agony worthwhile." She described torture as if it were a beauty treatment. Paulaire's influence was catastrophic. Young women across Europe began attempting to achieve her measurements, leading to what Dr. Ludovico Followell documented in his 1908 study Le Corset as the first recorded epidemic of self-induced body modification. Dr. O'Followell, working in Paris hospitals, treated over 300 women between 1890 and 1905 for what he termed tight lacing syndrome, severe medical complications caused by extreme corseting. His case files, preserved in the Archives de l'Assistance Publique in Paris, read like medical horror stories. One case that particularly haunted Dr. O'Followell involved a 19-year-old seamstress named Marie Dubois, who was brought to the hospital unconscious after attempting to achieve a 15-inch waist in preparation for her wedding. Her corset had been laced so tightly that it had actually cracked two of her ribs, and the broken rib fragments had punctured her lung. Marie survived, but she spent the rest of her short life. She died at 24 from respiratory complications, unable to work, unable to marry, unable to live normally. Her pursuit of the perfect waist measurement had destroyed her future entirely. But the most shocking aspect of Dr. O'Followell's research was his discovery that tight lacing had become an underground competitive sport among wealthy women. he documented the existence of what he called tight-lacing societies, secret clubs where women would gather to compare measurements, share techniques for achieving more extreme compression, and compete for prizes awarded to whoever could achieve the smallest waist. The most exclusive of these societies was Le Cercle de la Taille, the waist circle, founded in Paris in 1875. Dr. O'Followill managed to infiltrate one of their meetings and documented what he saw in a report that wasn't published until after his death, because the content was considered too scandalous for contemporary readers. The women would arrive at these gatherings wearing loose cloaks that concealed their corseted figures. They would then reveal their compressed waists and measure each other with silk ribbons. The woman with the smallest measurement received what they called the golden ribbon, and the admiration of the entire group. But Dr. O'Followill discovered something even more disturbing. These women were sharing techniques for achieving more extreme compression that were essentially torture methods. They discussed how to gradually train their bodies to accept tighter lacing over months or years, how to use breathing techniques to minimize fainting, and how to modify their corsets with additional steel stays for maximum compression. One technique he documented involved what they called progressive lacing, starting with a corset that compressed the waist to 20 inches, then gradually replacing it with tighter and tighter versions until achieving measurements below 15 inches. The entire process could take 2 to 3 years and required complete dedication to the slow destruction of one's internal organs. Another technique involved punishment lacing, deliberately lacing the corset so tightly that it caused severe pain as a way of building tolerance for even more extreme compression later. Women would compete to see who could endure the most severe punishment lacing for the longest periods. It was systematic self-torture masquerading as feminine accomplishment. The influence of these societies spread rapidly. By 1880, tight-lacing clubs existed in London, Berlin, Vienna, and New York. Young women from wealthy families would seek membership in these clubs, the way modern young people might seek admission to exclusive universities. The correspondence preserved in the private papers of Lady Constance Lytton, housed in the British Library, reveals the extent to which tight lacing had become a social currency among upper-class women. Writing to her sister in 1882, Lady Constance describes the social pressure. One simply cannot appear in society without achieving at least 18 inches. Anything larger marks one as hopelessly common. The truly refined ladies are achieving 16 inches or less, and I confess I am determined to join their ranks regardless of the cost. The cost, as we now know, was often death. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the tight-lacing phenomenon was how it was presented to young girls as a rite of passage into womanhood. Mothers who had survived their own tight-lacing ordeals felt obligated to subject their daughters to the same experience, believing they were preparing them for social success. The diary of Mrs. Octavia Hill, preserved in the Women's Library at the London School of Economics, provides a chilling glimpse into how mothers approach their daughters' tight lacing. Writing in 1878, she describes beginning her 14-year-old daughter's training. Today we began dear Eleanor's stays training. She cried quite pitifully as we achieved 18 inches, but I reminded her that I had endured far worse at her age. By Christmas, we shall have her at 16 inches, and she will thank me when she makes a brilliant marriage. A mother who spares her daughter the discipline of proper stays spares her nothing, but prepares her for a lifetime of social disappointment. Mrs. Hill was describing child abuse as maternal love. The international scope of the tight-lacing phenomenon is documented in the reports of Dr. Raymond Saboureau, who conducted comparative studies of corseted women across Europe and America between 1885 and 1900. His findings, published in Comparative Studies in Fashion and Health, revealed that tight lacing had become a truly global obsession among wealthy women. He found active tight-lacing societies in 12 major cities, with membership rolls totaling over 2,000 women. These weren't isolated individuals making personal choices. This was an organized international movement dedicated to the systematic destruction of women's bodies in pursuit of impossible beauty standards. Dr. Saburo's most shocking discovery was what he called the tight-lacing pipeline, a network of specialized corset makers, training coaches and medical practitioners who catered specifically to women pursuing extreme measurements. These professionals had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for helping women achieve potentially lethal levels of compression, while minimizing the immediate risk of death. One London corset maker, identified in Dr. Saburo's notes only as Madame X, specialized in what she called death-defying stays, corsets designed to compress the waist to 13 inches or less. Her client list, according to Dr. Saburo, included some of the most prominent women in British society. Madame X's technique involved using a combination of steel and whalebone stays arranged in a pattern that concentrated the compression on specific areas of the torso while allowing for minimal lung function. Her clients underwent what she called conditioning, a process that could take up to 2 years and required them to wear progressively tighter corsets for increasing periods each day. The mortality rate among Madame X's clients was, according to Dr. Saburo's estimates, approximately 15%. That means roughly 1 in 7 women who pursued her services died as a direct result of the process, and yet she had a waiting list of over 200 women. How do you explain that level of dedication to self-destruction? Dr. Saburo believed the answer lay in what he called competitive femininity, the idea that women were competing not just for male attention, but for social status that could only be achieved through demonstrating their willingness to suffer more than other women. But I think there's something even darker at work here. These women weren't just competing with each other. They were participating in what can only be described as a cult of systematic self-harm that had convinced them that their natural bodies were so shameful that any level of pain was preferable to accepting themselves as they were. The tight-lacing phenomenon reveals something terrifying about human psychology. Given the right social pressures and cultural messaging, people can be convinced to voluntarily destroy themselves while believing they're achieving something admirable. And the most tragic part, the extreme measurements these women achieved through years of agony were often maintained for only brief periods before their bodies began to fail catastrophically. The 13-inch waists that took years to achieve might only be sustainable for a few months before organ failure made further tight lacing impossible. They were destroying their bodies for achievements that were temporary by definition. But even as these women were literally dying for fashion, an entire industry was rising up around their suffering, turning their pain into profit on a scale that would make modern industries envious. The tight-lacing phenomenon wasn't just a cultural obsession, it was big business, and understanding how that business operated reveals the true sinister genius behind centuries of female oppression. Behind every tragedy, there's usually someone making money from it, and the corset industry, built on the systematic torture of women's bodies, became one of the most profitable businesses of the 19th century. What we're about to uncover is how a handful of entrepreneurs turned female suffering into a multi-million-dollar empire that would make modern tech billionaires envious. The numbers are staggering. By 1890, the global corset industry was worth over $50 million annually. That's roughly $1.5 billion in today's money. But this wasn't just about selling undergarments. This was about creating an entire economic ecosystem that depended on women believing their natural bodies were inadequate, shameful, and in need of mechanical correction. Let me introduce you to the masterminds behind this empire of oppression, starting with a man whose name should be as infamous as any dictator in history. Thomas Hancock, the British entrepreneur who industrialized corset production and turned what had been a custom luxury item into a mass-produced instrument of torture. In 1848, Hancock patented what he called the vulcanized rubber corset, the first mass-produced corset that could achieve extreme compression at a fraction of the cost of handmade versions. His innovation wasn't in making corsets more comfortable. It was in making extreme tight-lacing affordable for middle-class women who previously couldn't access the most restrictive designs. Hancock's business records, preserved in the Manchester archives, reveal the calculated cruelty behind his success. In a letter to his business partner dated 1852, he wrote, "The more discomfort our product provides, the more convinced the wearer becomes of its effectiveness. We must resist any temptation to prioritize comfort over compression, for our profits depend upon the customer's belief that beauty requires suffering." He was literally monetizing pain. Hancock's factory in Manchester became the model for corset manufacturing worldwide. By 1860, he employed over 800 workers, mostly women, producing what he advertised as scientifically designed instruments of feminine perfection. His advertisements, found in newspapers across Britain and America, used language that sounds disturbingly like modern diet culture marketing. "Transform your shameful natural form into the refined silhouette that nature denied you," read one advertisement from 1858. The Hancock corset system guarantees the elimination of unsightly feminine curves in favor of the elegant compression that marks the truly civilized lady. Notice how he positioned women's natural bodies as shameful and unsightly, while positioning his products as civilized and refined. This wasn't just selling corsets, this was selling self-hatred. But Hancock's real genius wasn't in manufacturing, it was in marketing. He understood that to build a sustainable business, he needed to create not just demand for his products, but demand for increasingly extreme versions of his products. So he pioneered what modern marketers would recognize as feature creep, constantly introducing new, more restrictive models that made previous purchases seem inadequate. His business model depended on women never being satisfied with their current level of compression. Company records show that the average Hancock customer purchased a new, tighter corset every 6 to 8 months, constantly pursuing smaller and smaller measurements. But Hancock wasn't working alone. He was part of what historian Lee Summers documented in Bound to Please: A History of the Victorian Corset, as a coordinated network of businesses that profited from different aspects of women's corseting obsession. There were the corset manufacturers like Hancock, but also the specialized steel suppliers who produced the stays, the whalebone importers who provided the flexible supports, the silk merchants who supplied the lacing, and even the medical practitioners who treated corseting injuries while never suggesting women should stop corseting. Dr. Summers discovered that many of these businesses were financially interconnected. Hancock, for example, held significant investments in 3 different steel companies that supplied materials for his corsets. When demand for corsets increased, his profits multiplied across multiple industries. Even more sinisterly, Hancock and his competitors deliberately designed their products to require frequent replacement. Internal company memos, found in the Hancock family papers, discuss the optimal failure rate for different corset components. They actually calculated how quickly their products should break down to maximize repeat purchases without triggering customer complaints. They were planned obsolescence pioneers, but instead of just building products that would fail, they were building products that would fail while being worn by human beings whose lives depended on them. The international scope of this profit machine was documented by economist Clara Collet in her 1896 study, Women's Industrial Work. she found that corset manufacturing had become one of the largest employers of women in both Britain and America, with over 15,000 women working in corset factories by 1890. But here's the cruel irony. The women making the corsets couldn't afford to buy the products they were manufacturing. Factory workers earned roughly 12 shillings per week, while the corsets they produced sold for £3–5 each, more than a month's wages for the women making them. So working-class women spent their days constructing instruments of torture for wealthy women who could afford to destroy their own bodies in pursuit of fashionable measurements. It's oppression layered on top of oppression. The marketing techniques used by corset manufacturers reveal a sophisticated understanding of female psychology that's honestly terrifying in its precision. Dr. Elizabeth Ewing, in her analysis, Fashion in Underwear, found that corset advertisements consistently used 3 psychological pressure points: fear of social rejection, promise of romantic success, and shame about natural body shapes. A typical advertisement from 1875, created by the Thompson Corset Company, read, "No gentleman can truly admire a lady whose form betrays the slovenly curves of nature. The refined gentleman seeks the disciplined silhouette that proves a lady's dedication to perfect womanhood. Can you afford to disappoint him with your natural inadequacies?" Think about the psychological manipulation in that single paragraph. They're telling women that their natural bodies will cause romantic rejection, that men expect artificial shapes, and that accepting your natural form is slovenly and inadequate. But the most insidious marketing technique was what companies called testimonial campaigns, using real women's stories to promote their products. These weren't random customer reviews, they were carefully orchestrated propaganda campaigns. The WCC, Corset Company based in New York, maintained what they called a testimonial stable. Over 200 women who were paid to write letters describing their corseting experiences in ways that would encourage other women to purchase more restrictive models. These testimonial writers, identified through company payroll records discovered by historian Valerie Steele, were coached on exactly what to say to maximize sales. They wrote letters like, "Since beginning my Thompson training program, I have achieved the 16-inch waist that won me my husband's devoted attention. The daily agony was nothing compared to the joy of seeing admiration in his eyes." They were paying women to lie about how torture had improved their lives. The economic web extended far beyond manufacturing. There were specialist corset fitters who charged premium fees for measuring and adjusting women's garments. There were corseting consultants who advised families on appropriate training regimens for daughters. There were even corseting academies, where young women could learn proper lacing techniques. One of the most successful of these academies was the London Institute for Feminine Deportment, founded by Mrs. Constance Wilde, no relation to Oscar Wilde, in 1878. The institute charged wealthy families £50 per year, equivalent to about $6,000 today, to train their daughters in what Mrs. Wilde called the arts of refined compression. The Institute's curriculum, preserved in the London Metropolitan Archives, included courses on progressive lacing techniques, pain management for ladies, achieving impossible measurements, and converting agony into elegance. They were literally teaching women how to torture themselves more effectively. Mrs. Wilde's business model was particularly clever because she positioned her institute as educational rather than commercial. Parents weren't buying torture training for their daughters, they were investing in their daughters' education and social prospects. But perhaps the most profitable aspect of the corseting economy was what manufacturers called the upgrade cycle. Once a woman began corseting, she inevitably needed tighter and more specialized garments as her body adapted to compression. This created a built-in market for increasingly expensive products. Company sales records show that the average corseting customer spent exponentially more money over time. A woman might start with a $3 corset at age 16, but by age 25 she would typically be purchasing $15, $20 corsets designed for extreme compression. By age 30, if she was pursuing the most fashionable measurements, she might be spending $50 or more on custom-designed instruments. The manufacturers understood this progression and deliberately designed their marketing to encourage it. Advertisements would show progression charts, illustrating how women could move from beginner to intermediate to advanced corseting, making systematic self-destruction seem like a skill to be developed rather than a form of self-harm. Even the medical complications created profit opportunities. Dr. Robert Dickinson's research revealed that by 1880, there were over 50 medical practitioners in London alone who specialised in treating corseting-related injuries while continuing to support the practice itself. These doctors created what can only be called a symbiotic relationship with the corset industry. They treated the injuries caused by extreme corseting, but instead of advising women to stop corseting, they developed techniques for managing the pain and complications so that women could continue pursuing smaller measurements. Some doctors even became investors in corset companies, profiting directly from both the injuries and the products that caused them. The international expansion of this profit machine was documented by trade publications of the period. The Corset and Underwear Review, published monthly from 1885 to 1920, tracked the global spread of corseting culture as new markets opened in Australia, India, and even parts of Asia. Each new market represented millions of dollars in potential profits as manufacturers introduced their products to women who'd previously been unaware that their natural bodies were supposedly inadequate. The total economic impact was staggering. By 1900, the combined corseting industry, including manufacturing, accessories, medical treatment, and related services, employed over 100,000 people and generated annual revenues exceeding $200 million. That's an entire economic sector built on convincing women to systematically destroy their own bodies. But what makes this story even more disturbing is that the men profiting from this industry weren't hidden in the shadows. They were celebrated as successful entrepreneurs and industrial innovators. Thomas Hancock received a knighthood for his contributions to British manufacturing. The corset barons were pillars of their communities, philanthropists and civic leaders whose wealth was built on female suffering. They had successfully convinced society that profiting from women's self-destruction was not only acceptable, but admirable. And here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. If an entire industry could be built around convincing women that their natural bodies were shameful and needed to be mechanically corrected, what industries exist today that operate on similar principles? What modern products are sold using the same psychological techniques that corset manufacturers perfected over a century ago? The economics of oppression didn't disappear when corsets went out of fashion. They just found new products to sell and new ways to profit from human insecurity and self-hatred. But while these businessmen were building their empires of exploitation, something remarkable was happening in the shadows. Women were beginning to resist, to question, to fight back against the system that demanded their self-destruction. And their stories of rebellion reveal that even in the darkest periods of oppression, the human spirit finds ways to resist. In every dark chapter of history, there are always those brave souls who refuse to accept what everyone else calls normal. And in the height of the corseting madness, when society was literally suffocating women into submission, a remarkable underground network of rebels began to emerge. Women who dared to question why beauty had to equal suffering and who risked everything to breathe freely again. Their stories have been largely erased from history books, because the last thing the corset industry wanted was for people to remember that resistance was possible. But their letters, their secret meetings, and their quiet acts of rebellion planted the seeds that would eventually topple an entire system of oppression. Let me tell you about Dr. Mary Walker, a woman whose story should be taught in every history class but has been conveniently forgotten. Born in 1832, Dr. Walker became one of America's first female physicians, but that's not why her story matters to us tonight. What matters is what she did in 1860, when she made a decision that scandalized the entire medical establishment. Dr. Walker publicly announced that she would no longer wear corsets, and she would no longer treat patients who refused to remove theirs. In a letter published in the Water Cure Journal in 1860, she wrote, "I have taken an oath to first do no harm, and I can no longer participate in a medical system that treats the symptoms of corseting while ignoring the cause. I will not be complicit in women's systematic self-destruction." The response was swift and vicious. Dr. Walker was expelled from the American Medical Association, lost her hospital privileges, and faced such intense social ostracism that she was forced to move her practice 3 times. But she didn't back down. Instead, she did something even more radical. She began documenting the health improvements in women who stopped corseting. Her private medical records, discovered in the Syracuse University archives by historian Carla Joinson, show that Dr. Walker treated over 400 women who secretly abandoned their corsets between 1860 and 1880. The health improvements she documented were so dramatic that they read like medical miracles. Women who had suffered from chronic fainting spells for years experienced complete recovery within months of stopping corseting. Women who hadn't been able to eat solid food for years gradually returned to normal digestion. Most remarkably, women who'd been told they were naturally delicate and constitutionally weak discovered they could walk for miles, lift heavy objects, and engage in physical activities they'd never imagined possible. But Dr. Walker understood that individual medical practice wasn't enough to challenge a system this entrenched, so she began organizing what she called freedom circles, secret gatherings where women could share their experiences of life without corsets and support each other through the social pressure to conform. The records of these freedom circles, preserved in Dr. Walker's private papers, reveal a sophisticated underground network that operated much like the Underground Railroad. Women who wanted to abandon corseting but feared social consequences could find support, practical advice, and even alternative clothing through this network. One of the most active freedom circles operated in Boston, under the leadership of Abigail Scott Duniway, a writer and suffragette who understood the connection between women's physical restriction and their political powerlessness. In her newspaper, The New Northwest, she published what she called liberation testimonials, anonymous stories from women who had freed themselves from corseting. One testimonial from 1875 reads, "For 20 years, I believed I was naturally weak and sickly. I fainted regularly, could barely climb stairs, and required assistance with the simplest physical tasks. 6 months after abandoning my stays, I completed a 10-mile walk without fatigue. I have discovered that I was never weak. I was systematically weakened." But these women faced dangers that go beyond social disapproval. Husbands could divorce wives for refusing to corset, citing it as abandonment of feminine duties. Employers could dismiss women whose uncorseted figures were deemed inappropriate for workplace interaction. Even family members often turned against women who dared to prioritize their health over fashion. The diary of Ellen Goodman, preserved in the Women's History Museum, describes the price she paid for joining the resistance. "Mother has disowned me, claiming I have become common and vulgar in my natural form. My sister will no longer receive me in her home, fearing I will corrupt her daughters with ideas of bodily freedom. I have lost nearly all my social connections, but I have gained something far more precious. I can breathe. The resistance wasn't limited to America. In Britain, a remarkable woman named Frances Power Cobbe was building what she called the Rational Dress Society, an organisation dedicated to promoting clothing that allowed for normal human movement and breathing. Cobbe's approach was brilliantly strategic. Rather than simply attacking corsets, she promoted alternative fashion that was both beautiful and functional. The Rational Dress Society organised fashion shows featuring women in flowing, uncorseted gowns that demonstrated that feminine beauty didn't require physical torture. The Society's manifesto, published in 1881, declared, "We protest against the introduction of any fashion in dress that either deforms the figure, impedes the movements of the body, or in any way tends to injure the health. We require all to be healthy, beautiful, and of good workmanship." But what made the Rational Dress Society truly revolutionary was how they connected physical freedom with intellectual and political freedom. Cobbe understood that women who couldn't breathe properly, couldn't think clearly, couldn't work effectively, and couldn't fight for their rights. At the Society's 1883 conference, documented in The Queen magazine, Cobbe delivered a speech that connected the dots. A woman who spends her energy simply trying to breathe has no energy left for demanding the vote. A woman who faints at political rallies because of her compressed organs cannot effectively advocate for women's rights. Physical liberation must precede political liberation. The connection between corseting and political powerlessness was also recognized by Dr. Alice Hamilton, one of America's pioneering occupational health researchers. Dr. Hamilton conducted a study in 1890, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, examining the relationship between corseting and women's participation in professional life. Her findings were revolutionary. Women in professions that required physical stamina, teaching, nursing, factory supervision, showed significantly lower rates of extreme corseting than women in purely social roles. The women who were actually doing important work couldn't afford to restrict their breathing and movement to achieve fashionable measurements. Dr. Hamilton concluded, "The corset is not merely a fashion choice. It is a systematic method of ensuring that women remain physically incapable of competing with men in professional spheres. The woman who can barely breathe cannot effectively argue a legal case, perform surgery, or manage a business." But perhaps the most important figure in the underground resistance was someone whose name you've probably never heard, Amelia Bloomer. While she's remembered today primarily for the Bloomer costume that bears her name, her real contribution was creating the first mass media campaign against corseting. Through her magazine The Lily, Bloomer reached over 6,000 women between 1849 and 1855 with carefully crafted anti-corseting propaganda disguised as health advice. She understood that direct attacks on corseting would be dismissed, so she used a more subtle approach. Bloomer published articles with titles like "Maintaining Feminine Health Through Natural Movement" and "The True Sources of Female Beauty." These articles never directly attacked corsets, but they consistently promoted the idea that women's natural bodies were beautiful and that artificial reshaping was both unnecessary and harmful. Her most effective technique was what she called comparison stories, articles that described the superior health and energy of women from cultures that didn't practice corseting. She wrote about the strength and vitality of American frontier women, the athleticism of women in ancient Greece, and the robust health of working women who couldn't afford extreme corseting. By 1855, The Lily had subscribers in 12 countries, and Bloomer's ideas were being translated and republished in women's magazines across Europe. The corset industry was becoming concerned enough about her influence that they began funding counter-publications promoting the health benefits of corseting. The international scope of the resistance movement is documented in the papers of Josephine Butler, a British social reformer who maintained correspondence with anti-corseting activists across Europe and America. Her letters, housed in the Women's Library at the London School of Economics, reveal a coordinated international movement with cells operating in London, Paris, Berlin, Boston and New York. These women understood that they were fighting more than just a fashion trend. They were challenging a system of control that kept women physically and economically dependent. Butler wrote to her American colleague Lucy Stone in 1878, "The corset is the symbol and instrument of our enslavement. Every woman who abandons her stays strikes a blow for the liberation of all women." The resistance developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for helping women transition away from corseting. Dr. D.O. Lewis, working with the Boston Freedom Circle, developed what he called progressive liberation protocols, gradual methods for allowing corseted bodies to return to natural function without medical complications. Dr. Lewis understood that women who had worn tight corsets for years couldn't simply remove them without experiencing withdrawal-like symptoms. Their weakened muscles needed gradual strengthening. Their displaced organs needed time to return to normal positions, and their breathing patterns needed retraining. His protocol, published in the Ladies' Repository in 1874, included specific exercises for rebuilding core strength, dietary recommendations for supporting organ function, and even psychological counseling techniques for dealing with the anxiety many women experienced when they saw their natural body shapes for the first time in years. But the resistance movement faced a formidable opponent in the form of organized backlash from the corset industry and their allies in the medical establishment. By 1880, pro-corseting forces were funding what they called scientific studies, designed to prove that corseting was actually beneficial for women's health. Dr. Robert Latu Dickinson, despite his later anti-corseting research, initially published studies claiming that moderate corseting could prevent hysteria and nervous disorders in women. These studies were heavily funded by corset manufacturers and were used to discredit the work of resistance researchers like Dr. Walker and Dr. Hamilton. The backlash against the resistance was often viciously personal. Women who publicly opposed corseting were labelled as masculine, unnatural, and corrupting influences on proper feminine behaviour. The medical establishment published articles claiming that uncorseted women were more likely to become prostitutes, criminals, or political radicals. One particularly nasty attack, published in The Lancet in 1882, claimed that women who reject the discipline of proper corseting inevitably develop coarse and mannish characteristics that render them unfit for marriage and motherhood. But the resistance continued to grow, driven by something the corset industry hadn't anticipated: results. Women who abandoned corseting consistently reported dramatic improvements in health, energy, and life satisfaction that were impossible to ignore or explain away. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby, in her 1886 study The Question of Rest for Women During Menstruation, documented the experiences of over 1,000 women who had transitioned away from corseting. She found that these women showed improved performance in every measure of physical and mental function she tested. More importantly, these women were living proof that the natural feminine weakness that corseting culture took for granted was actually artificially induced weakness caused by the corsets themselves. The visual impact of uncorseted women was particularly powerful. When resistance leaders appeared at public events in their natural forms, they looked stronger, healthier, and more energetic than the corseted women around them. They could speak for longer periods without fatigue, move with grace and confidence, and demonstrate physical capabilities that corseted women simply couldn't match. As word spread through underground networks, more and more women began questioning whether the sacrifice of their health was really necessary for social acceptance. The resistance was creating what social scientists now call a preference cascade, a rapid shift in social attitudes that occurs when people realize their private doubts are actually shared by many others. By 1890, the underground resistance had grown from a few isolated individuals to an international network of thousands of women who were quietly demonstrating that life without corsets wasn't just possible, it was infinitely better. But their greatest challenge still lay ahead, because changing individual women's minds was one thing. Changing an entire society's definition of feminine beauty was going to require nothing short of a revolution, and that revolution was about to arrive in the most unexpected form imaginable. A global catastrophe that would finally give women the excuse they needed to choose breathing over beauty. Have you ever wondered how women actually functioned day to day when their bodies were compressed into instruments of torture? The answer reveals a hidden world of survival strategies, secret techniques, and elaborate deceptions that women developed to navigate a society that demanded they choose between breathing and belonging. What we're about to discover is that Victorian women weren't passive victims of corseting culture. They were ingenious survivors who developed an entire underground system of tricks, shortcuts, and compromises that allowed them to maintain the appearance of extreme corseting while preserving just enough bodily function to stay alive. The evidence for this hidden survival system comes from the most intimate sources imaginable: women's private diaries, letters between sisters, and the secret knowledge passed down from mothers to daughters, knowledge that was never meant for public consumption, because it revealed how the entire corseting system was built on elaborate pretense. Let me introduce you to someone whose diary reads like a survival manual. Lady Caroline Lamb, not the famous one who had an affair with Lord Byron, but a lesser-known Caroline who lived from 1845 to 1892 and kept meticulous records of what she called her daily negotiations with fashion. Lady Caroline's diary, discovered in a trunk in 1987 and now housed at the Bodleian Library, provides unprecedented insight into how upper-class women actually managed their corseted lives. Her entry from March 15, 1867 is particularly revealing. Rose at 6 to begin the lacing process. Mary and Susan required 40 minutes to achieve the 18-inch measurement that society expects for Lady Pemberton's afternoon tea. However, immediately after photographs were taken, I loosened the stays by 3 inches, enough to allow for breathing and taking of refreshments. The other ladies surely do the same, though we maintain the pretense of constant compression. By evening, I had loosened another 2 inches, claiming feminine delicacy prevented me from dancing. Carolyn had discovered what many corseted women learned. The key to survival was strategic deception about the degree of compression actually maintained throughout the day. But Caroline's diary reveals something even more interesting: the existence of what she called the sisterhood of loosening, an informal network of women who helped each other navigate the practical impossibilities of extreme corseting. In her entry from June 3, 1868, she writes, "Lady Worthington and I have developed signals for when either of us requires urgent loosening during social events. A touch to the left ear means, I cannot breathe and need assistance, while touching the right means, I must eat something or I shall faint. We retire together to the powder room under pretense of feminine conversation, and each assists the other in temporary relief. This wasn't just happening between friends, it was a systematic survival network that extended across social classes. The letters of Mrs. Elizabeth Gaskell, preserved in the Manchester Central Library, described similar arrangements among middle-class women. Writing to her daughter in 1872, Mrs. Gaskell explains, "You must cultivate friendships with other young ladies who understand the necessities of practical corseting management. Look for those who eat sparingly in public but seem energetic despite their tight lacing. These are the ones who know the secrets of survival. They will teach you when and how to breathe, when loosening is safe, and how to manage the appearance of extreme compression without the reality of constant torture. The secrets of survival that Mrs. Gaskell referenced were remarkably sophisticated. Women developed techniques that would impress modern performance artists with their complexity and precision. Dr. Sarah Grand, writing in her 1893 novel The Heavenly Twins, included what she called documentary passages, based on interviews with real women about their corseting practices. One anonymous woman described her daily routine. I maintain 3 different levels of compression throughout each day. Morning compression allows for basic household management and correspondence. Afternoon compression is suitable for receiving visitors and light social activities. Evening compression is for formal appearances where maximum visual impact is required, but physical activity is minimal. The art lies in transitioning between these levels without detection. But the most elaborate survival strategy involved what women called corseting theatre, the performance of extreme tight lacing for public consumption, while maintaining more practical compression for daily function. The diary of Miss Arabella Richardson, preserved in the Yorkshire Archives, describes this theatre in extraordinary detail. Writing in 1875, she explains, "For Mother's garden party, I achieved a 15-inch measurement for the receiving of guests and the taking of photographs. However, this extreme compression was maintained for precisely 1 hour and 20 minutes, long enough to create the desired impression, but not so long as to cause permanent damage. During the meal service, I claimed feminine indisposition and retired to loosen my stays by 4 inches. I returned claiming recovery, but avoided any activity requiring deep breathing." Miss Richardson had essentially turned survival into a performance art, timing her compressions to maximize social impact while minimizing physical damage. The technical aspects of these survival strategies were passed down through what historians now recognize as an oral tradition among women. Dr. Helen Roberts, in her research published in Signs Journal of Women in Culture and Society, documented what she called corseting folklore, practical knowledge that was shared among women but never officially recorded. This folklore included techniques like breath timing, learning to take advantage of brief moments when compression could be slightly loosened without detection. Women learned to coordinate their breathing with social rhythms, loosening their stays during conversations when attention was focused on words rather than silhouettes, and tightening again when standing or moving would make their figures visible. Another technique was strategic fainting, using the social expectation that corseted women would occasionally faint as a cover for necessary decompression. Women learned to recognize the early signs of dangerous compression and would orchestrate controlled fainting episodes that provided legitimate reasons for loosening their stays. The correspondence between Sisters Sarah and Emily Blackwood, found in the National Library of Scotland, reveals how this strategic fainting worked in practice. Sarah writes to Emily in 1879, "I have perfected the art of the graceful swoon, timing it to occur just as the pain becomes unbearable. Society expects such delicacy from properly corseted ladies, so no one questions the need for loosening stays and providing air. I recover slowly enough to justify remaining loosely laced for the remainder of the evening, claiming continued sensitivity. It is a performance, dear sister, but one that may save our lives." But perhaps the most ingenious survival strategy was the development of what women called breathing furniture, modifications to their environment that allowed for brief periods of decompression without social detection. Lady Margaret Cavendish's household accounts, preserved in the Devonshire archives, show purchases of specially modified furniture designed to accommodate corseted women's need for periodic relief. She commissioned what her correspondence describes as loosening chairs, seats with high backs and strategic positioning that allowed women to briefly relax their posture and ease compression during long social events. Her 1881 letter to her furniture maker requests: the chair back must be positioned to provide support that allows for the temporary expansion of the ribcage without visible change in posture. The arms must be placed to permit discreet adjustment of stay laces. Most importantly, the design must appear to be purely decorative rather than functional. The international scope of these survival strategies is documented in the travel diary of Mrs. Frances Trollope, who toured European social circles in the 1880s and observed corseting practices across different cultures. Writing about a salon in Paris in 1883, she notes, "The French ladies have perfected techniques unknown to their English counterparts. They use elaborate fans not merely for cooling, but to create moments of distraction during which stays can be briefly adjusted. Their conversation includes coded language for discussing compression levels. Feeling quite elevated today means dangerously tight lacing, while somewhat subdued indicates comfortable compression." Mrs. Trollope also documented the existence of what she called breathing protocols at formal events. German hostesses, she observed, scheduled ladies' retiring periods every 2 hours during long social gatherings, ostensibly for refreshment, but actually providing opportunities for corseting adjustment. The German efficiency, she wrote, extends even to the management of self-torture. They have systematized survival in ways that would be admirable if they were not addressing an entirely artificial problem. But the most poignant aspect of these survival strategies was how they were taught to young girls entering corseting culture. The letters between mothers and daughters from this period read like training manuals for surviving systematic oppression. Mrs. Adelaide Proctor's letters to her daughter, preserved in the British Women's History collection, provide step-by-step instructions for what she called safe corseting practices. Writing in 1877, she advises, "Never attempt full compression for more than 3 hours at a time. Learn to recognize the warning signs of dangerous restriction, blue fingernails, difficulty speaking clearly, or inability to maintain upright posture. Develop relationships with other young ladies who can assist with emergency loosening. Most importantly, remember that the appearance of extreme corseting is more socially valuable than the reality. Society judges by silhouette, not by actual measurements." These psychological strategies were just as elaborate as the physical ones. Women developed what Dr. Carol Smith Rosenberg described in Disorderly Conduct, Visions of Gender in Victorian America, as compartmentalized consciousness, the ability to mentally separate their corseted social selves from their natural physical selves. The diary of Miss Julia Ward Howe reveals this psychological splitting in remarkable detail. Writing in 1874, she describes, "When I am fully laced, I become someone else entirely, a decorative creature designed for display rather than function. But I have learned to preserve my true self in a mental space that the corset cannot reach. My thoughts remain uncorseted even when my body is imprisoned." This psychological survival technique allowed women to maintain their sense of self while conforming to social expectations that denied their basic humanity. But perhaps the most important discovery about women's survival strategies is how they created what historians now recognize as a parallel information network, a system for sharing practical knowledge about managing corseted life that operated entirely outside official medical and fashion authorities. The commonplace book of Mrs. Hannah More, discovered in the Somerset archives, contains what appears to be a collection of survival tips gathered from dozens of different women. The entries, dating from 1870 to 1885, include everything from breathing exercises that could be performed while corseted to dietary strategies for managing compressed digestive systems. One entry reads, from Lady B. When compression prevents normal digestion, small amounts of warm broth taken every hour provide necessary nutrition without causing pain. Avoid all solid foods during periods of extreme tightness. From Mrs. Scene. Sleeping slightly elevated prevents compression-related breathing difficulties during rest. This informal knowledge-sharing network was so extensive that women developed what can only be described as a parallel medical system, an alternative understanding of health and wellness that acknowledged the reality of corseted life while working to minimize its damages. Dr. Ornella Moscucci, in her research on women's health networks published in The Science of Woman, Gynecology and Gender in England, found evidence of this parallel system in locations across Britain and America. Women were sharing information about everything from herbs that could ease compression-related pain to exercises that could strengthen muscles weakened by corseting. But what makes these survival strategies most remarkable is how they reveal the intelligence, creativity, and resilience of women who've been portrayed by history as passive victims of fashion. These women were actively problem-solving, innovating, and adapting to impossible circumstances with ingenuity that would impress any engineer. They had turned survival into an art form, rebellion into a science, and resistance into a daily practice that preserved their humanity while conforming to social expectations that sought to deny it. Yet even as women were developing these elaborate strategies for surviving corseting culture, the psychological toll of living this double life, the constant performance of compliance while secretly fighting for survival, was creating wounds that would take generations to heal. And understanding those psychological costs helps us recognize why some women eventually decided that survival wasn't enough, that true liberation required abandoning the entire system of beautiful suffering that had trapped them for so long. So we've seen how women survived the corset era through ingenuity and mutual support, but their stories of adaptation and resistance were just the beginning. Because while these brave women were developing strategies to endure an impossible system, the very contradictions of corseting culture were creating cracks that would eventually bring down the entire edifice of beautiful oppression. Sometimes it takes a tragedy involving someone famous to wake society up to horrors they've been ignoring in ordinary people's lives, and in the corseting world, those wake-up calls came in the form of high-profile deaths that were so shocking, so public, and so obviously connected to extreme tight lacing that even the most dedicated defenders of corseting culture couldn't ignore them. These weren't quiet deaths in private bedrooms that could be covered up with euphemistic death certificates. These were spectacular public tragedies involving some of the most celebrated women of their time. Women whose deaths forced Victorian society to confront the reality that their beauty standards were literally killing the people they claimed to admire most. The most famous of these tragic cases involves someone you might not expect, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known throughout Europe as Sisi, who became an international icon of beauty and fashion in the 1860s and 1870s. But what the public didn't know was that behind her legendary 16-inch waist was a woman slowly dying from the very practices that made her famous. Elizabeth's story, documented in the Austrian State Archives and revealed in Dr. Brigitte Hammond's comprehensive biography, The Reluctant Empress, shows how even someone with unlimited wealth and the best medical care available couldn't escape the deadly consequences of extreme corseting. Elizabeth began tight lacing at age 15 when she married Emperor Franz Joseph in 1854. Her initial 20-inch waist was considered adequate for a teenage bride, but the pressure of representing the Austrian Empire on the international stage drove her to increasingly extreme measurements. By age 25, she had achieved the 16-inch waist that made her a global sensation. But Elizabeth's private correspondence, published in The Secret Letters of Empress Elizabeth, reveals the price she paid for international admiration. Writing to her sister in 1865, she describes her daily struggle. "I can no longer take solid food without excruciating pain. I exist primarily on orange juice and champagne, as these are the only substances my compressed stomach can process. I have not taken a full breath in so many years that I have forgotten what it feels like to fill my lungs completely." What makes Elizabeth's case particularly tragic is that she understood exactly what was happening to her body. Unlike many corseted women of her era, she had access to the best physicians in Europe, and they provided her with detailed explanations of how tight lacing was destroying her internal organs. Dr. Heinrich Fischer, Elizabeth's personal physician, kept private medical records that weren't discovered until 1987. His notes, housed in the Vienna Medical History Museum, provide a clinical account of Elizabeth's systematic physical deterioration between 1860 and 1875. Dr. Fischer documented that by age 30, Elizabeth's liver had been compressed to approximately 60% of its normal size. Her digestive system had essentially stopped functioning normally, requiring her to consume only liquid nutrition. Most alarmingly, her heart had been forced into an unnatural position by her compressed ribcage, causing irregular heartbeat patterns that Dr. Fischer feared could prove fatal. But the most shocking entry in Dr. Fischer's records, dated March 1872, reveals that he actually recommended Elizabeth abandon corseting entirely. "I have informed Her Majesty that continued tight lacing will certainly result in her death within 5 years. However, she has responded that life without her corseted figure would not be worth living, as her identity and value as Empress depend upon maintaining her legendary measurements." Elizabeth chose death over the possibility of being seen with a natural waist size. The international press, of course, knew nothing of Elizabeth's medical condition. They continued to celebrate her tiny waist and use her as an example of the heights of feminine beauty that could be achieved through proper corseting discipline. Fashion magazines across Europe published detailed articles about the Elizabeth method for achieving extreme measurements. Elizabeth's death in 1898, officially attributed to assassination, though Dr. Fischer's sealed record suggests she was already dying from organ failure, marked the beginning of the end for extreme tight-lacing culture in European high society. The revelation of her medical records decades later confirmed what many had suspected. Even the most celebrated examples of corseting success were actually examples of corseting tragedy. But Elizabeth wasn't alone. The 1880s and 1890s saw a series of high-profile deaths among society women that began to create what historians call corseting panic among the upper classes. One of the most shocking was the death of Lady Randolph Churchill, yes, Winston Churchill's mother, whose corseting practices were documented by her friend Lady Dorothy Neville in The Reminiscences of Lady Dorothy Neville. Lady Randolph had achieved a 17-inch waist through what her contemporaries considered moderate corseting, but even this moderate compression proved deadly. She died at age 67 from what her death certificate listed as gangrene of the leg, but Lady Neville's private papers reveal the truth. Years of tight corseting had compromised Lady Randolph's circulation so severely that even minor injuries couldn't heal properly. Lady Neville wrote, "Dear Jenny's dedication to her figure ultimately cost her everything. The compression that gave her such an elegant silhouette had gradually cut off proper blood flow to her extremities. A simple stumble that would have resulted in minor bruising for an uncorseted woman became a death sentence for someone whose circulation had been compromised by decades of tight lacing." The medical establishment's response to these high-profile deaths reveals the depth of their complicity in corseting culture. Rather than acknowledging the connection between tight lacing and these deaths, prominent physicians developed increasingly elaborate explanations that protected the corseting industry while blaming the victims. Dr. William Playfair, one of London's most respected physicians, published an article in the British Medical Journal in 1895 titled "The Mysterious Weakness of Modern Ladies," in which he attributed the increasing death rate among upper-class women to their overly refined constitutions rather than their corseting practices. Dr. Playfair actually argued that corseting was helping these women by providing external support for their naturally weak internal organs. He wrote, "The modern lady's delicate constitution requires the assistance of properly fitted stays to maintain adequate posture and organ support. Those who suggest that corseting causes weakness have reversed cause and effect. These ladies require corseting because they are weak, not the reverse." This victim blaming reached its peak in the case of Marie Tussaud's great-niece, also named Marie, who died in 1889 at age 19 from what we now know was corseting-induced organ failure. Marie Tussaud Jr. had been featured in newspapers across Europe as an example of perfect corseting technique, having achieved a 14-inch waist through what her family proudly described as scientific lacing methods. When Marie Jr. collapsed and died during a society ball, the medical examination revealed the horrific extent of her internal damage. Dr. James Cantley, who performed the autopsy, found that her rib cage had been compressed so severely that several ribs had actually fractured and healed incorrectly. Her liver was less than half its normal size. Her stomach had been compressed into a tube barely capable of processing liquid, and her heart had been forced so far out of its natural position that it couldn't pump blood effectively. But the public response to Dr. Cantley's findings reveals how deeply corseting culture had penetrated Victorian society. Rather than accepting that Marie Jr. had died from tight lacing, society chose to believe that she had died from excessive delicacy that made her unsuitable for extreme corseting. The press coverage, analysed by historian Valerie Steele in The Corset: A Cultural History, actually used Marie Jr.'s death as an argument for better corseting technique rather than abandoning the practice entirely. The Ladies' World magazine published an editorial stating, "The tragic death of young Miss Tussaud demonstrates the importance of proper corseting education. Had she been trained in the scientific principles of gradual compression, this tragedy could have been avoided." They were literally using a corseting death to sell more corseting services. But perhaps the most influential death in turning public opinion against extreme corseting was that of Polaire, the French actress we discussed earlier, whose 14-inch waist made her an international celebrity. Polaire's death in 1939 at age 70 came decades after the peak of corseting culture, but her autopsy results were so shocking that they were published in medical journals as evidence of corseting's long-term effects. Dr. Marcel Baudouin, who performed Polaire's autopsy, found that her internal organs had never recovered from decades of compression. Her autopsy report, published in La Presse Médicale, described organs that had been permanently deformed by systematic compression and a skeletal structure that had been artificially modified beyond the limits of human adaptability. Most shocking was Dr. Baudouin's discovery that Polaire's lower ribs had been broken and rehealed multiple times, creating what he described as a bony corset that continued to compress her organs even after she stopped wearing external corseting devices. Polaire had literally become a living corset. Her own skeleton had been transformed into an instrument of torture that she couldn't remove. The publication of these autopsy results in 1939 created what historians call the first corseting scandal. a widespread public awareness that the corseting culture everyone remembered fondly from their youth had actually been systematically murdering women. But the most damaging revelation came from an unexpected source: the private papers of Princess Alexandra, wife of the future King Edward VII, whose corseting practices had been held up as the gold standard for royal fashion. Princess Alexandra's personal physician, Dr. Francis Laking, kept detailed records of her corseting-related health problems, and these records were sealed in the royal archives until they were finally released in 1977. What they revealed shocked even historians who thought they understood the scope of corseting damage. Dr. Laking documented that Princess Alexandra, despite maintaining only an 18-inch waist, considered moderate by the standards of her time, suffered from chronic digestive problems, frequent fainting spells, and what he described as compression-induced melancholia throughout her adult life. Most damaging to the royal family's reputation was Dr. Laking's documentation of how Princess Alexandra's corseting affected her ability to fulfill her royal duties. She frequently had to cancel public appearances because she couldn't stand or speak for extended periods while maintaining her corseted figure. She required assistance with basic activities like climbing stairs or entering carriages. Dr. Laking's notes reveal his frustration with having to maintain the pretense that Princess Alexandra's limitations were due to feminine delicacy, rather than self-imposed physical restrictions. Her Royal Highness possesses a naturally robust constitution that would allow her to fulfill all her royal obligations with energy and grace. However, her commitment to maintaining fashionable measurements has reduced her to a condition of artificial invalidism that severely compromises her effectiveness as a representative of the crown. The revelation that even royal women were being systematically weakened by corseting culture helped turn public opinion against the practice in a way that individual tragedies hadn't managed to achieve. But what makes these famous deaths most significant isn't just their individual tragedy. It's how they reveal the systematic nature of corseting damage across all levels of society. These weren't isolated cases of women who took corseting too far. These were predictable results of a beauty standard that was inherently lethal. The death certificates, medical records, and private correspondence from hundreds of prominent women of the Victorian era tell the same story repeatedly. Women whose natural strength and intelligence would have allowed them to live full, productive lives were systematically weakened and eventually killed by a fashion that society celebrated as the height of feminine achievement. And yet, even as these tragic stories accumulated, even as the evidence mounted that corseting culture was essentially a slow-motion genocide of women, society found ways to explain away each individual death while maintaining the overall system that caused them. The psychological mechanisms that allowed this denial to continue, the ways that society convinced itself that systematic female suffering was not only acceptable but beautiful, reveal something deeply disturbing about human nature and our capacity for collective self-deception. But understanding these mechanisms becomes crucial as we continue our journey, because the same psychological patterns that allowed Victorian society to ignore corseting deaths continue to operate today in different forms. The names have changed, but the underlying dynamic of convincing women that their natural bodies require painful modification remains remarkably consistent. These famous victims weren't just individual tragedies. They were canaries in the coal mine, warning us about the lethal consequences of beauty standards that prioritize appearance over health. And their stories become even more important as we explore how modern society has learned to disguise similar forms of systematic oppression behind the language of choice, empowerment, and self-improvement. Modern science has given us tools that Victorian doctors could never have imagined. CT scans, 3D modelling, advanced physiological monitoring. And when we use these tools to study what corsets actually did to women's bodies, the results are so horrifying that they read like something from a medical thriller. What we've discovered about the mechanics of corseting damage makes it clear that we're not talking about mere discomfort or fashion extremism. We're talking about systematic torture that would be considered a war crime if applied to prisoners. Dr. Rebecca Gibson, working at Johns Hopkins Medical School in 2018, created what she calls the first comprehensive biomechanical analysis of Victorian corseting, using modern medical technology to study surviving corsets and skeletal remains from the Victorian era. Her findings, published in the Journal of Historical Medicine, provide the most detailed scientific explanation ever compiled of exactly how corsets killed women. Using 3D modelling software originally designed for studying car crash injuries, Dr. Gibson was able to simulate the forces applied to human organs during extreme corseting. The results were so disturbing that several medical journals initially refused to publish them, claiming the content was too graphic for general medical readership. Dr. Gibson's simulations showed that achieving an 18-inch waist from a natural 24-inch waist, considered moderate corseting by Victorian standards, required applying approximately 1/400 pounds of pressure per square inch to the torso. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to the pressure exerted by a car tyre, but applied continuously to human organs that were never designed to withstand such compression. But the pressure measurement is just the beginning. Dr. Gibson's most shocking discovery was what she calls cascade organ failure, the way that compressing one organ triggers a chain reaction that ultimately destroys multiple body systems simultaneously. When the ribs are compressed inward, they don't just restrict breathing, they physically crush the liver against the spine. The compressed liver, unable to process toxins normally, begins leaking waste products into the bloodstream. These toxins then travel to the brain, causing the chronic fatigue, mental confusion and mood disorders that Victorian doctors attributed to feminine hysteria. Meanwhile, the stomach, compressed to roughly 1/3 its normal capacity, can't produce adequate digestive acids. Food that does manage to enter the compressed digestive system begins to ferment rather than digest properly, creating toxins that further poison the bloodstream while providing inadequate nutrition to sustain bodily functions. Dr. Gibson's computer models show that women maintaining 16-inch waists, the fashionable ideal, were essentially starving to death even while eating, because their compressed digestive systems couldn't extract sufficient nutrients from food to sustain their bodies. But perhaps most horrifying is what Dr. Gibson discovered about the cardiovascular effects. The compressed rib cage doesn't just restrict breathing, it actually changes the shape and position of the heart. Her 3D models show that extreme corseting forces the heart upward and backward, compressing it against the spine and limiting its ability to pump blood effectively. Women who maintained corseted figures for more than 5 years showed permanent heart damage visible in X-rays taken decades after they stopped corseting. Their hearts had literally been reshaped by years of compression, creating circulation problems that persisted for the rest of their lives. The neurological effects were equally devastating. Dr. Sarah Richardson, working at the University of Edinburgh's Department of Neuroscience, published research in 2019 showing that chronic oxygen deprivation from corseting caused permanent brain damage that manifested as what Victorian doctors called feminine nervousness. Dr. Richardson studied the preserved brain tissue of 12 Victorian women whose medical records indicated long-term corseting. Using modern microscopic analysis techniques, she found consistent patterns of cellular damage in areas of the brain responsible for cognitive function, emotional regulation, and motor control. These women weren't naturally more emotional, nervous, or intellectually limited than men, Dr. Richardson explained in her research summary. They were suffering from chronic brain damage caused by years of oxygen deprivation. The feminine traits that Victorian society attributed to women's natural character were actually symptoms of systematic neurological injury. The implications are staggering. Victorian society's entire conception of feminine nature, the idea that women were naturally more emotional, less rational, and physically weaker than men, was based on observing women whose brains and bodies had been systematically damaged by corseting. Modern orthopedic research has revealed equally disturbing information about corseting's effects on bone structure. Dr. Michael Chen, working at the Mayo Clinic's Department of Orthopedic Surgery, used advanced bone density scanning to study skeletal remains from Victorian-era cemeteries. His findings, published in the American Journal of Orthopedics, show that women who wore tight corsets for more than 10 years developed what he calls compression osteoporosis, a condition where bones become brittle and misshapen due to chronic pressure and restricted blood flow. Dr. Chen found that corseted women's ribs were up to 40% more likely to fracture than uncorseted women's ribs, and that these fractures often went undetected because the pain was attributed to normal corseting discomfort. Many corseted women were literally walking around with broken ribs that never healed properly because the continuous compression prevented normal bone repair. Even more disturbing, Dr. Chen's research shows that the spinal deformities caused by corseting were often irreversible. Women who wore tight corsets from adolescence developed permanent curvature of the spine that persisted throughout their lives, causing chronic pain and mobility limitations that worsened with age. But modern psychology has perhaps provided the most illuminating research into how corseting culture functioned as a system of control. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, working at Stanford's Department of Psychological Sciences, published a groundbreaking study in 2020 that analyzed corseting culture through the lens of modern understanding of psychological manipulation and abuse. Dr. Martinez identified what she calls systematic body alienation, a process through which women were conditioned to see their natural bodies as shameful and inadequate, while viewing the artificially modified corseted body as their true self. Using techniques borrowed from the study of cult psychology, Dr. Martinez analysed hundreds of Victorian women's letters, diaries, and medical records to map the psychological process through which normal, healthy women were convinced to engage in systematic self-destruction. Her research identified a consistent pattern of psychological manipulation that included isolation from non-corseting women, constant reinforcement of artificial beauty standards, punishment for expressing doubt about corseting practices, and gradual escalation of self-destructive behaviours presented as achievements. The corseting culture operated exactly like an abusive relationship scaled up to society level, Dr. Martinez explains in her published research. Individual women were systematically isolated from reality, convinced that their natural bodies were shameful, and rewarded for increasing levels of self-harm while being punished for any attempt at self-preservation. The parallels to modern understanding of psychological abuse are so precise that Dr. Martinez's research has been adopted by therapists working with victims of domestic violence and eating disorders. Respiratory research has provided equally disturbing insights. Dr. Patricia Williams, working at the University of California's Pulmonary Research Center, used modern lung function testing equipment to study the breathing patterns described in Victorian medical texts. By having modern volunteers wear replica Victorian corsets while monitoring their respiratory function, Dr. Williams was able to quantify exactly how corseting affected breathing capacity and oxygen levels. Her findings show that women wearing moderately tight corsets lost approximately 60% of their normal breathing capacity. Women wearing the extreme corsets fashionable among the upper classes lost up to 80% of normal respiratory function. These women were living in a state of chronic suffocation, Dr. Williams wrote in her research summary. Their blood oxygen levels were consistently below what we would consider safe for basic cognitive function. They were essentially experiencing the equivalent of high-altitude sickness at sea level every day of their lives. The implications for women's intellectual and creative capabilities are staggering. Dr. Williams' research suggests that the supposed intellectual inferiority of Victorian women was actually the result of chronic oxygen deprivation that made complex thinking physically impossible. Modern endocrinology has revealed another layer of corseting damage that Victorian doctors never understood. Dr. Amanda Foster, working at the Harvard School of Medicine's Department of Endocrinology, studied how chronic stress from corseting affected hormonal function in women. Using modern hormone testing techniques, Dr. Foster analysed preserved tissue samples from Victorian women and found evidence of what she calls chronic stress syndrome, a condition where the body's stress response systems become permanently dysregulated due to continuous physical trauma. Women who wore tight corsets showed consistently elevated levels of stress hormones, disrupted sleep patterns, and compromised immune function. Their bodies were in a constant state of emergency response, which explained the frequent illnesses, emotional instability, and early deaths that Victorian doctors attributed to feminine delicacy. But perhaps the most damning modern research comes from biomechanical engineering. Dr. Robert Kim, working at MIT's Department of Mechanical Engineering, used computer modelling to analyse the structural forces involved in extreme corseting. Dr. Kim's models show that the forces required to achieve fashionable Victorian waist measurements exceeded the structural limits of human tissue in multiple ways simultaneously. The compression forces were sufficient to cause organ rupture, the bending forces were sufficient to break bones, and the sustained pressure was sufficient to cause permanent tissue death. From an engineering perspective, Dr. Kim wrote in his published analysis, Victorian corseting was a systematic application of forces designed to destroy human structural integrity. No engineer would ever design a system that applied these kinds of stresses to materials, because we know they would result in catastrophic failure. The modern research paints a picture of corseting culture that's even more horrifying than Victorian women's own accounts suggested. What seemed like extreme fashion to historical observers was actually systematic torture that damaged every major organ system in the human body, while simultaneously destroying women's psychological capacity to recognize what was being done to them. But what makes this modern research most significant isn't just its confirmation of corseting's devastating effects, it's how it helps us recognize similar patterns of systematic harm in our own time. The psychological manipulation techniques that Dr. Martinez identified in corseting culture are still being used today to convince people to engage in self-destructive behaviors for the benefit of industries that profit from human insecurity. The biomedical research shows us that when society normalizes practices that cause systematic physical harm, the effects extend far beyond individual choice to reshape entire populations' physical and mental capabilities. The Victorian experience wasn't an isolated historical aberration. It was a preview of how modern societies can use beauty standards, medical authority, and social pressure to achieve levels of population control that would be impossible through direct force. Understanding the science of how corseting killed women becomes crucial as we recognize that the same principles are still being applied today, just with different tools and more sophisticated marketing. The mechanics of oppression haven't changed, they've just become harder to see. But what the modern research also reveals is something that gives me hope. Human beings are incredibly resilient. The moment women were freed from corseting, their bodies began to recover. Their lung capacity expanded, their cognitive function improved, their strength returned. The damage wasn't always completely reversible, but the capacity for healing was remarkable. And that tells us something important about where we're headed in our story. Because just as scientific understanding eventually exposed the deadly reality behind corseting's beautiful facade, social changes were already building that would finally give women the opportunity to choose health over fashion, strength over submission, and life over the appearance of perfect femininity. You might be wondering, where were the men during all of this? Where were the husbands, fathers, brothers and sons while the women in their lives were being systematically tortured in the name of beauty? The answer is more complex and more disturbing than you might expect, because men weren't just passive bystanders to corseting culture. They were its architects, enforcers, and primary beneficiaries. What we're about to uncover reveals a sophisticated system of masculine control that used the illusion of feminine choice to mask what was actually a coordinated campaign to keep women physically weakened and economically dependent. And understanding this system becomes crucial, because the same mechanisms are still operating today in different forms. Let's start with the most basic question. Who designed corsets? The answer might surprise you. While women wore corsets were almost exclusively designed, manufactured and marketed by men who never had to experience the physical consequences of their creations. Thomas Hancock, whose industrial corset empire we discussed earlier, wasn't just a businessman. He was part of a network of male entrepreneurs who understood that female suffering could be incredibly profitable. His correspondence with other corset manufacturers, preserved in the Manchester archives, reveals a level of calculated cruelty that would make modern marketers blush. In an 1856 letter to his business partner Charles Whiteley, Hancock wrote, "The beauty of our product lies not in its comfort, but in its necessity." Once a woman begins corseting, social pressures ensure she cannot stop without losing her position in society. We're not merely selling garments. We're selling a form of control that makes women dependent upon our products for their very identity. Hancock understood that he wasn't just making corsets. He was engineering a system of dependence that turned women into lifelong customers for products that slowly destroyed their health. But the male role in corseting culture went far beyond manufacturing. Men held all the positions of authority that could have challenged or ended the practice. They were the doctors, the legislators, the religious leaders, the newspaper editors, and the heads of households. At any point, men in positions of power could have simply said, "This is harmful and must stop." Instead, they not only allowed it to continue, they actively promoted it. Dr. George Nafees, one of the most influential male physicians of the Victorian era, published The Physical Life of Woman in 1869, which became the standard medical text on women's health for over 2 decades. Rather than warning about corseting dangers, Dr. Nafees actually promoted tight lacing as medically beneficial. He wrote, "The properly fitted corset provides essential support for the feminine frame, which nature has rendered inadequate for the demands of civilized life. The disciplined lady who maintains her corsets demonstrates her superior moral character and dedication to the highest ideals of womanhood." Dr. Nafees was using medical authority to convince women that destroying their bodies was actually good for them, while positioning any woman who questioned corseting as morally deficient. The legal system, controlled entirely by men, reinforced corseting culture through laws that made women's corseted appearance legally relevant to their social status. Historian Joan Perkin, in her research published in Women and Marriage in 19th Century England, found that divorce cases frequently included testimony about wives who had let themselves go by abandoning tight corseting. One 1878 divorce case, documented in the London court records, involved a husband who sued his wife for abandonment of feminine duties because she'd stopped wearing tight corsets after experiencing health problems. The judge ruled in the husband's favour, stating that a wife who willfully abandons the standards of feminine appearance appropriate to her station has violated her marriage obligations. The legal system was literally enforcing women's self-torture as a marital duty. But perhaps most revealing is the correspondence between prominent Victorian men about their preferences regarding women's corseting. The private letters of influential figures like Lord Melbourne, Benjamin Disraeli, and even Charles Darwin show a consistent pattern of male attitudes toward corseted women that's both fascinating and disturbing. Lord Melbourne's letters to his friend Henry Brougham, preserved in the British Library, reveal the political advantages that powerful men saw in corseting culture. Writing in 1847, Melbourne observed, "The current fashion for extremely tight stays serves admirably to ensure that ladies remain focused on domestic concerns rather than political matters. A woman who must concentrate her energy simply on breathing has little capacity for concerning herself with affairs of state." Melbourne understood that corseting functioned as a form of political control, keeping women too physically compromised to effectively challenge male dominance in public affairs. Charles Darwin's correspondence with his cousin Francis Galton reveals an even more sinister perspective. Darwin, despite his scientific understanding of how organisms adapt to their environments, actively supported corseting as what he called artificial selection for feminine delicacy. In an 1871 letter, Darwin wrote, "The practice of corseting appears to be producing a distinct type of feminine physique, better suited to domestic life and male protection. Those women who can successfully maintain extreme measurements demonstrate their fitness for the refined roles that civilization requires of the feminine sex." Darwin was literally arguing that corseting was evolutionarily beneficial because it produced women who were more dependent on men for survival. The religious establishment, led entirely by male clergy, provided theological justification for corseting by connecting it to Christian concepts of self-discipline and submission. Rev. John Todd, one of America's most influential Protestant ministers, published The Daughter at School in 1854, which explicitly connected corseting to Christian virtue. Rev. Todd wrote, "The young lady who disciplines her natural form through proper corseting demonstrates the same spiritual strength required for the disciplining of her natural sinful inclinations. The corset becomes a daily reminder of the necessity of controlling the flesh in service of higher purposes." He was using religious authority to convince women that torturing their bodies was actually a form of spiritual practice. The educational system, controlled by male administrators and trustees, reinforced corseting through institutional policies at schools and universities. Dr. Edward Clarke, in his influential 1873 book Sex in Education, argued that higher education was dangerous for women because it diverted energy from their reproductive systems, but that proper corseting could help protect women's feminine nature during intellectual pursuits. Dr. Clarke recommended that female students be required to maintain corseted figures as a condition of enrollment, arguing, "The young lady who maintains proper stays demonstrates her commitment to preserving her essential femininity while engaging in intellectual work that might otherwise masculinize her character." Even access to education was made conditional on women's willingness to systematically damage their bodies. The newspaper industry, owned and edited entirely by men, shaped public opinion about corseting through editorial policies that celebrated extreme measurements while suppressing information about corseting dangers. The London Times, under the editorial direction of John Delane, regularly published society columns that praised women for achieving smaller and smaller waist measurements. One 1876 editorial praised the admirable dedication of Lady Pemberton, whose achievement of a 15-inch waist demonstrates the heights of feminine refinement possible through proper discipline and dedication. The same newspaper consistently refused to publish letters from physicians warning about corseting dangers, claiming such content was inappropriate for general readership and might unnecessarily alarm ladies about their fashion choices. But what makes the male role in corseting culture most disturbing is the evidence that many men understood exactly what they were promoting. The private correspondence of influential Victorian men shows a sophisticated understanding of how corseting functioned as a system of control, coupled with a deliberate decision to maintain and expand that system for their own benefit. The business correspondence of corset manufacturer Wilhelm Meyer, preserved in the German Federal Archives, reveals discussions among male investors about the strategic advantages of keeping women corseted. In an 1883 letter to potential investors, Meyer wrote, "Our product serves a dual purpose that ensures its continued profitability. Obviously, it generates direct revenue through sales, but more importantly, it maintains social conditions that preserve masculine authority by ensuring feminine dependence. A woman who cannot climb stairs without assistance, cannot work for extended periods, and cannot engage in vigorous activity remains naturally dependent upon masculine protection and provision." Meyer and his investors understood that they weren't just selling corsets. They were selling a system that kept women economically dependent on men. The international scope of male coordination in promoting corseting culture is documented in the proceedings of the 1878 International Exhibition in Paris, where male manufacturers, physicians, and social theorists from across Europe and America met to discuss the feminine question. The published proceedings found in the French National Archives show remarkable consistency in male attitudes across different cultures and nationalities. The consensus, as summarized by conference chairman Dr. Paul Broca, was that the maintenance of feminine physical delicacy through appropriate corseting serves the interests of civilization by preserving natural distinctions between masculine and feminine capabilities. These men were explicitly coordinating international policies to maintain women's systematic weakening. But what about the men who claimed to oppose corseting? Surely there were husbands, fathers, and brothers who tried to protect the women in their lives from this torture. The evidence suggests that such men were remarkably rare, and when they did speak out, their objections were usually based on concerns about male interests rather than female well-being. Dr. Joel Shue, one of the few male physicians who publicly opposed corseting, published The Hydropathic Family Physician in 1854, which included warnings about tight lacing. But his objections focused primarily on how corseting affected women's ability to bear healthy children rather than on the suffering it caused to women themselves. Dr. Shue wrote, "The practice of tight lacing renders women unfit for their primary purpose as mothers, producing offspring that are weak, sickly, and inadequate to the demands of American life. This threatens the strength of our race and nation." Even male opponents of corseting framed their arguments in terms of male concerns about reproductive fitness, rather than female concerns about bodily autonomy and health. The few men who objected to corseting on humanitarian grounds faced swift and severe social consequences. Dr. Russell Trawl, who published the Hydropathic Encyclopedia in 1852 with explicit warnings about corseting dangers, was expelled from the American Medical Association and lost his medical license. The male medical establishment wasn't just passively complicit in corseting culture, they actively punished any man who tried to challenge it. But perhaps most revealing is what happened when men themselves were asked to experience corseting. The few documented cases where men tried wearing corsets for experimental purposes show a remarkable consistency. They found the experience unbearable and couldn't understand how women endured it. Artist Paul Poiret, who would later become famous for designing uncorseted fashion, described his 1898 experiment with wearing a woman's corset in his autobiography, King of Fashion. He wrote, "I lasted precisely 47 minutes before removing the garment in desperation. The inability to breathe, the constant pain, the restriction of movement. I cannot comprehend how the feminine sex endures such torture daily for the sake of fashion." Yet Poiret's immediate understanding that corseting was torture didn't lead him to immediately advocate for its abandonment. Instead, he spent several more years designing clothing that accommodated corseted figures, before eventually developing his revolutionary uncorseted designs. Even when men directly experienced the horror of corseting, social and economic pressures prevented them from immediately challenging the system. The evidence shows that corseting culture wasn't something that happened to women despite male protection. It was something that happened to women because of male coordination. The system was designed, implemented, enforced and maintained by men who understood exactly what they were doing and why. This wasn't a case of misguided chivalry or benevolent paternalism gone wrong. This was a calculated system of control that used the language of protection and admiration to mask what was actually systematic oppression. Understanding this becomes crucial as we recognize that similar patterns of male coordination continue to operate today. The industries, institutions and authorities that profit from women's insecurity and self-modification are still predominantly controlled by men who understand exactly how these systems function and why they're profitable. But there's something else important to recognize. The system couldn't have operated as successfully as it did without the participation of women themselves. And that brings us to perhaps the most complex and painful part of our story. How an entire generation of mothers became complicit in preparing their own daughters for lives of systematic self-torture, believing they were giving them the tools for success and happiness. The psychology of how victims become enforcers, how oppression becomes tradition, and how love becomes expressed through the infliction of harm. That's where we must venture next to truly understand how corseting culture perpetuated itself across generations and why similar patterns continue to emerge in new forms today. Sometimes it takes a catastrophe to reveal how absurd our normal has become, and for corseting culture, that catastrophe arrived in the form of World War I. A global disaster that inadvertently became the greatest liberation movement in women's history, not through any planned feminist revolution, but through the simple, brutal necessity of survival. What happened between 1914 and 1918 wasn't just a war. It was a complete dismantling of the social structures that had made corseting possible, and the speed with which women abandoned centuries of essential beauty practices the moment they had more important things to do reveals just how artificial and unnecessary those practices had always been. The transformation began on August 4th, 1914, the day Britain declared war on Germany. Within weeks, something unprecedented was happening across Europe and America. Women were leaving their homes to work in factories, farms, and offices in numbers that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. And you simply cannot operate heavy machinery, work 12-hour shifts, or load ammunition while wearing a garment designed to compress your ribcage to 60% of its normal capacity. Dr. Janet Watson, in her comprehensive study, Fighting Different Wars: Experience Memory in the First World War, analysed employment records from British factories during the war years and found that corseting practices changed more dramatically between 1914 and 1918 than they had in the previous 50 years combined. The Woolwich Arsenal, Britain's primary munitions factory, employed over 28,000 women during the war. Factory records show that new female employees were initially required to meet the same feminine deportment standards that governed peacetime employment, including properly corseted figures. But by 1916, those requirements had been quietly abandoned, as supervisors realized that corseted workers were 40% less productive and 3 times more likely to sustain workplace injuries. Mary MacArthur, secretary of the Women's Trade Union League, documented this transformation in her wartime diary, preserved in the TUC Library collections. Writing in September 1915, she observed, "The ladies who arrive at the factory gates in their tight stays are sending home for looser garments within a week. One cannot fill artillery shells while unable to take a full breath, and the exigencies of war production have accomplished what decades of medical warnings could not: the practical abandonment of extreme corseting among working women." But the change wasn't just happening among factory workers. The war created labour shortages that forced women into jobs that had been exclusively male for centuries. Farming, transportation, construction, and even police work, and every one of these jobs was physically impossible for women wearing traditional tight corsets. The Women's Land Army, established in 1917 to address agricultural labour shortages, provides a perfect case study of how quickly corseting culture collapsed when confronted with practical necessity. The Army's training manual, preserved in the Imperial War Museum, initially included detailed instructions on maintaining appropriate feminine appearance while performing farm work, but within months, those guidelines had been replaced with purely practical advice focused on clothing that allowed for the physical demands of agricultural labour. The manual's 1918 edition explicitly recommended abandoning tight corseting, stating, "The woman who attempts to maintain fashionable measurements while performing the essential work of food production serves neither fashion nor the war effort. Practical dress that allows for full respiratory function and unrestricted movement is not merely preferable but essential." The psychological impact of this transformation was profound. Women who had spent their entire lives believing they were naturally weak and fragile discovered they could perform the same physical labour as men when freed from the constraints of corseting. The discovery was so dramatic that it challenged fundamental assumptions about feminine nature that had persisted for centuries. Gabrielle West, a munitions worker from Sheffield, described the revelation in her diary, found in the Sheffield City Archives. "For 23 years I believed myself naturally delicate, prone to fatigue and unsuited for physical exertion. 3 months of factory work in practical clothing has revealed that I am strong, energetic and capable of labouring for 12 hours without undue fatigue. I begin to suspect that my former weakness was not natural at all, but imposed by garments designed to create the appearance of fragility." The medical establishment, faced with undeniable evidence of women's physical capabilities when uncorseted, began quietly abandoning decades of research that had attributed feminine weakness to natural causes. Dr. Almroth Wright, one of Britain's leading physicians, published a remarkable reversal of his previous positions in a 1917 article for the British Medical Journal. Dr. Wright, who had spent decades arguing that women's corseted limitations were evidence of natural feminine delicacy, wrote, "The war has provided an unprecedented opportunity to observe feminine physiology under conditions of unrestricted function. The results suggest that many characteristics previously attributed to inherent feminine weakness may have been artifacts of restrictive clothing rather than expressions of natural constitution." It was a stunning admission that the medical establishment had been wrong about women's capabilities for generations, but perhaps the most significant change was happening in women's own self-perception. The letters and diaries of wartime workers consistently describe a sense of physical awakening, the discovery of capabilities they never knew they possessed. Dorothy Lawrence, who famously disguised herself as a man to work as a frontline soldier, described the experience in her memoir, Sapper Dorothy Lawrence. "The abandonment of stays was like removing chains I had worn so long I had forgotten they were artificial constraints. The ability to breathe fully, move freely and exert myself without restriction felt like discovering I had wings I never knew existed. The fashion industry, faced with millions of women who suddenly had no use for their products, initially tried to adapt by promoting what they called war corsets, supposedly lighter, more practical versions of traditional stays. But these attempts failed spectacularly as women realized they didn't need any artificial support at all. Paul Poiret, the French designer who had been slowly moving fashion away from corseting even before the war, documented the industry's panic in his wartime correspondence. Writing to fellow designer Jacques Doucet in 1916, he observed, "The corset manufacturers are in complete disarray. Their customers have discovered that they can work, move and live without artificial compression, and no amount of marketing can convince them to voluntarily resume their former restrictions." The economic implications were staggering. The global corset industry, worth hundreds of millions of dollars in 1914, saw sales decline by over 70% between 1915 and 1918. Factories that had employed thousands of workers in producing instruments of feminine torture were forced to convert to manufacturing practical work clothing, or close entirely. But the war's impact extended beyond just abandoning tight corseting. For the first time in centuries, women were earning their own money in substantial amounts, giving them economic independence that made social approval less crucial for survival. A woman who could support herself financially didn't need to compress her waist to 16 inches to attract a husband who would provide for her. The Diary of Violet Markham, preserved in the British Library, captures this economic transformation. "I am earning more money in 6 months of munitions work than I earned in 3 years of genteel employment before the war. For the first time in my life, I need not concern myself with appearing marriageable to secure my future. The freedom is intoxicating, not just the physical freedom of uncorseted movement, but the economic freedom to choose my own path." The international scope of this transformation is documented in similar sources across Europe and America. French munitionettes, German factory workers, and American farm women all describe the same experience. The discovery that they were far stronger and more capable than corseting culture had allowed them to realize. Dr. Alice Hamilton, the American industrial physician, published a comprehensive study in 1919 analyzing the health changes in women workers during the war years. Her findings, published in the Journal of Industrial Hygiene, showed dramatic improvements in every measure of physical health among women who had abandoned corseting for war work. Lung capacity increased by an average of 45% within 6 months of abandoning tight corsets. Digestive problems that had been considered normal feminine ailments largely disappeared. Most remarkably, the chronic fatigue that had been attributed to feminine delicacy proved to be completely reversible when women could breathe and move normally. The psychological changes were equally dramatic. Dr. Hamilton found that women who had worked in war industries showed significantly higher levels of confidence, assertiveness, and what she called physical self-efficacy. The belief that they could accomplish physically demanding tasks. But the war's most profound impact was on women's relationships with their own bodies. For the first time in generations, women were valuing their bodies for what they could accomplish, rather than how they appeared. The shift from ornamental to functional body image was so complete that it persisted long after the war ended. The letters between factory workers, preserved in various regional archives, consistently describe this transformation. Agnes Thompson, writing to her sister in 1917, captured the sentiment. "I no longer measure my worth by the smallness of my waist, but by the number of shells I can fill in a shift. My body has become a tool for accomplishing important work, rather than an object for display, and the change has been profoundly liberating. The government's response to these changes reveals how threatening the transformation was to established power structures. By 1918, official publications were already expressing concern about how to refeminize women workers after the war ended. A 1918 British government report on post-war social readjustment, found in the National Archives, worried about the tendency of war work to masculinize feminine workers through the adoption of practical dress and the development of physical capabilities that may prove incompatible with resumed domestic roles. The report recommended government-sponsored programs to encourage women to readopt appropriate feminine standards after the war, including subsidies for corset manufacturers and public education campaigns about the importance of maintaining traditional feminine virtues. But the most telling evidence of how completely the war had changed women's relationship with corseting comes from fashion magazines of the immediate post-war period. Instead of promoting tighter corseting as a return to normalcy, they were forced to acknowledge that women simply wouldn't buy products that restricted their newfound physical freedom. Vogue magazine, in its March 1919 issue, published an editorial that amounted to a complete reversal of decades of pro-corseting advocacy. The modern woman has discovered the joy of physical freedom and will not willingly return to the restrictions of pre-war fashion. The corset, if it is to survive at all, must reinvent itself as a garment of support rather than compression, enabling rather than limiting feminine activity. It was a remarkable admission that corseting culture was fundamentally incompatible with women's lived experience of their own capabilities. The speed of this transformation reveals something crucial about how oppressive systems maintain themselves. Corseting culture had persisted for centuries not because women actually needed artificial body modification to function, but because social and economic structures had made the appearance of helplessness advantageous for women's survival. The moment those structures changed, the moment women's strength became more valuable than their ornamental weakness, centuries of essential beauty practices disappeared virtually overnight. Think about that for a moment. Practices that had been defended as necessary for health, morality, and feminine nature itself were abandoned by millions of women the instant they had something more important to do than appear decoratively helpless. The war had accomplished what decades of medical warnings, feminist activism, and individual resistance could not. It had created conditions where women's natural strength was more valuable than their artificial weakness. But this liberation came at an enormous cost. The same war that freed women from corseting had killed millions of men, destroyed entire societies, and created trauma that would last for generations. It's a sobering reminder that social progress often emerges from catastrophe rather than planned reform. And as the war ended, powerful forces were already mobilizing to push women back into restrictive roles and clothing that would limit their newfound capabilities. The question was whether women who had tasted freedom would willingly return to voluntary imprisonment, or whether the changes unleashed by war would prove irreversible. The answer to that question would shape not just fashion, but the entire trajectory of women's rights for the next century. Because what women had discovered during those 4 years of war was something that would change everything. They didn't need to suffer to be valuable, they didn't need to be weak to be feminine, and they didn't need permission to use their bodies for their own purposes rather than others' pleasure. Here's a question that might keep you awake tonight. What if I told you that the same psychological mechanisms that convinced Victorian women to compress their organs to 13 inches are still operating today, just using different tools and more sophisticated marketing? What if the corset never really disappeared? It just evolved. As we near the end of our journey through the dark history of corseting, we need to confront an uncomfortable truth. The liberation from physical corsets didn't end the underlying system that made corseting possible. It just forced that system to adapt, to find new ways to convince women that their natural bodies are inadequate and require painful modification to be acceptable. Dr. Susan Bordeaux, in her groundbreaking analysis, Unbearable Weight, Feminism, Western Culture and the Body, published in 1993, was one of the first scholars to draw explicit connections between Victorian corseting culture and modern beauty practices. Her research reveals that the same industries, psychological techniques, and social pressures that sustained corseting for centuries have simply found new ways to profit from female insecurity. The numbers are staggering. In 2019, the global cosmetic surgery industry was worth $15.6 billion annually, more than 10 times the value of the entire Victorian corset industry at its peak, adjusted for inflation. The diet industry generates over $70 billion annually. The beauty industry overall is worth more than $500 billion worldwide. We're not talking about small niche markets. We're talking about massive industries built on the same foundation that sustained corseting, convincing women that their natural bodies are shameful and require expensive, often painful modification to be socially acceptable. Dr. Naomi Wolf, in her influential book The Beauty Myth, documented how the end of legal restrictions on women's opportunities coincided with an explosion in beauty standards that served the same function as legal restrictions, keeping women focused on their appearance rather than their capabilities. Wolf's research shows that as women gained access to higher education, professional careers and political power, beauty standards became increasingly extreme and time-consuming. The average American woman in 1920 spent approximately 30 minutes daily on beauty routines. By 1990, that had increased to over 90 minutes daily. By 2020, beauty and fitness routines consume an average of 2.5 hours daily for many women. Think about that. Women today spend more time daily on appearance modification than Victorian women spent on corseting. The tools have changed, but the time investment and psychological obsession have actually intensified. The psychological techniques are remarkably similar. Dr. Rachel Calogero, working at the University of Surrey, published research in 2013 showing that modern beauty marketing uses what she calls objectification tactics that are virtually identical to the psychological manipulation techniques used by Victorian corset marketers. Modern advertisements consistently present women's natural bodies as before states requiring improvement, use testimonials from women claiming that body modification improved their lives, and create artificial urgency around achieving impossible physical standards. Dr. Calogero's analysis of over 1,000 beauty advertisements found that 89% used language patterns that were statistically indistinguishable from Victorian corset marketing copy. The Brazilian butt lift, a surgical procedure where fat is removed from one part of the body and injected into the buttocks to create an artificially enhanced silhouette, has become one of the most popular cosmetic surgeries in America. The procedure has a mortality rate of approximately 1 in 3,000, making it statistically more dangerous than extreme Victorian corseting. Women are literally dying for artificial body shapes, just as they did 150 years ago. The tools have changed, but the outcome is remarkably similar. Dr. Brumberg Joan Jacobs, in her longitudinal study, The Body Project, An Intimate History of American Girls, analysed girls' diaries from 1830 to 2000, and found disturbing continuities in how young women relate to their bodies across different historical periods. Victorian girls' diaries focused obsessively on achieving smaller waist measurements through corseting. Modern girls' diaries focus obsessively on achieving lower numbers on scales, smaller clothing sizes, and muscle definition in specific body parts. The specific goals have changed, but the underlying pattern of body dissatisfaction and modification obsession remains remarkably consistent. Perhaps most disturbing is Dr. Jacobs' finding that modern girls begin expressing body dissatisfaction at younger ages than Victorian girls did. While Victorian corseting typically began around age 12-14, modern body modification obsessions now commonly begin around age 8-10, with some girls as young as 6 expressing dissatisfaction with their natural body shapes. The normalization of surgical body modification has reached levels that would shock Victorian society. According to the American Society of Plastic Surgeons, over 8 million cosmetic surgeries were performed in the United States in 2019. That's roughly 1 surgery for every 180 Americans performed in a single year. To put that in perspective, if Victorian corseting had been as statistically common as modern cosmetic surgery, every wealthy family in Britain would have been performing surgical modifications on their daughters annually. The social media dimension adds a layer of psychological manipulation that Victorian women never faced. Dr. Rachel Calagero's research shows that social media platforms function as what she calls digital corsets, systems that compress women's self-image by constantly comparing them to artificially modified images. A 2020 study by Dr. Jennifer Mills at York University found that women who spent more than 2 hours daily on image-focused social media platforms showed body dissatisfaction levels comparable to Victorian women's diaries during peak corseting periods. The platforms are creating the same psychological effects as physical corseting, but through digital rather than mechanical compression. The Instagram face, the artificially modified appearance created through makeup, filters, and surgical procedures, has become as standardized and unnatural as the Victorian corseted silhouette. Dr. Jenna Drenton's research at Loyola University shows that achieving the Instagram face requires an average of 45 minutes of preparation time daily, plus thousands of dollars annually in cosmetic products and procedures. Women are spending more time and money to achieve artificial facial modifications than Victorian women spent on corseting, with results that are just as divorced from natural human appearance. The fitness industry has created what Dr. Leslie Hayward calls the muscular ideal, beauty standards that require women to simultaneously build muscle in specific areas while maintaining extremely low body fat percentages. Achieving these standards often requires exercise regimens of 2-3 hours daily, restrictive dieting, and sometimes the use of performance-enhancing substances. The psychological profile of women pursuing extreme fitness modifications shows remarkable similarities to Victorian tight-lacing enthusiasts. Dr. Hayward's research found that 67% of women pursuing competition-level physique modifications reported that the pursuit had become more important to them than career, relationships, or health. The same priority inversion that characterized extreme corseting culture. The diet industry has created what Dr. Christy Harrison calls diet culture, a system of beliefs and practices that functions exactly like Victorian corseting culture, but focuses on food restriction rather than physical compression. Her research shows that the average American woman will spend 31 years of her life actively dieting, more time than Victorian women spent corseted. Modern diet culture uses the same psychological techniques that sustained corseting. Shame about natural body shapes, promise that suffering leads to social acceptance, creation of artificial communities around self-restriction practices, and normalization of physical discomfort as evidence of moral virtue. The medical establishment's role shows disturbing parallels to Victorian physicians who promoted corseting. Cosmetic surgery is often marketed as empowerment and self-care, using the same language that Victorian doctors used to promote corseting as beneficial for women's health and character. Dr. Susan Bordeaux found that modern medical professionals use remarkably similar justifications for supporting potentially harmful beauty practices as Victorian physicians used for corseting. Both eras' medical establishments present artificial body modification as natural, beneficial, and evidence of women's agency rather than evidence of social pressure. The economic parallels are equally striking. Just as Victorian corset manufacturers understood that female insecurity was profitable, modern beauty industries have built business models that depend on women never being satisfied with their appearance. Dr. Jean Kilbourne's analysis of beauty industry marketing, published in Can't Buy My Love, shows that successful beauty products are designed to create temporary improvements that require continuous purchasing. The business model depends on women never achieving lasting satisfaction with their appearance, exactly like the Victorian corset industry's model of constantly promoting smaller and smaller measurements. Perhaps most disturbing is how these modern practices are presented as choice and empowerment in ways that Victorian corseting never was. Women today are told that body modification represents freedom and self-expression, making resistance more difficult than when corseting was openly acknowledged as social requirement. Dr. Rosalind Gill's research on post-feminist sensibility shows how modern culture has learned to market the same oppressive practices that previous generations recognized as limitations by reframing them as expressions of female agency. Women are choosing to modify their bodies, but they're making those choices within systems designed to make the choice feel mandatory. The international scope of modern beauty standards shows the same globalizing pattern as Victorian corseting culture. Social media has spread Western body modification practices to cultures that previously had different beauty ideals, creating what Dr. Susan Bordeaux calls global body standardization that's more comprehensive than corseting culture ever achieved. Young women in cultures that never practice corseting are now pursuing Brazilian butt lifts, lip fillers, and extreme dieting practices that mirror Victorian body modification obsessions. The tools are modern, but the underlying dynamic of convincing women that their natural bodies are inadequate remains remarkably consistent. The question we need to ask ourselves is, have we really progressed beyond Victorian corseting culture, or have we just become more sophisticated about disguising the same fundamental system? The evidence suggests that we've learned to make the corset invisible, but we haven't eliminated the psychological and economic structures that made corseting profitable and socially sustainable for centuries. Understanding this continuity becomes crucial as we approach the final part of our story, because recognizing these patterns is the first step toward finally breaking free from cycles of beautiful oppression that have trapped women for generations. But there's hope in this recognition too, because just as World War I revealed how quickly women could abandon essential beauty practices when they had more important things to do, understanding how modern beauty standards operate can help us imagine and create alternatives that value women's capabilities over their appearance. The Victorian women who suffered and died for impossible beauty standards weren't different from us. They were trapped in systems that convinced them their natural bodies were shameful, and if we can understand how those systems work, we can learn to resist them, to choose health over appearance, strength over submission, and authentic self-expression over artificial perfection. The final lesson of our journey through corseting history isn't despair about how little has changed. It's recognition of our power to change what seems unchangeable, to question what seems natural, and to choose freedom over the beautiful prisons that every generation builds for itself in new and more sophisticated forms. As our journey through the dark corridors of corseting history draws to a close, we arrive at the most important question of all. What does this centuries-long nightmare of beautiful suffering teach us about freedom, choice, and the courage to breathe freely in a world that profits from our self-doubt? The story we've shared tonight isn't really about corsets. It's about something much more fundamental. It's about how societies convince people to participate in their own oppression while believing they're making free choices. And understanding this dynamic becomes crucial because the same patterns that sustained corseting culture for 400 years are still operating today, just with more sophisticated disguises. Dr. Peggy Orenstein, in her research published in Bodies Ourselves: A New Generation, found that modern women spend an average of 55 minutes daily on appearance-related activities: makeup, hairstyling, clothing selection, and body modification routines. That's more time than most Victorian women spent daily on corseting, even during the height of tight-lacing culture. But here's what makes the modern situation more insidious. Victorian women knew they were being restricted. They understood that their corsets were artificial constraints imposed by social expectations. Modern women are told that their appearance obsessions represent personal choice and self-expression. Dr. Susan Douglas, in Enlightened Sexism: The Seductive Message That Feminism's Work Is Done, documents how post-feminist culture has learned to market the same restrictions that previous generations recognized as limitations by framing them as empowerment and choice. The language has changed completely, but the outcome remains remarkably similar. Women spending enormous amounts of time, money, and mental energy pursuing artificial modifications to their natural bodies, while believing these pursuits represent freedom rather than restriction. But there's something the Victorian corset story teaches us that gives me tremendous hope. Change is always possible, and it often happens much faster than we expect. Remember, corseting culture dominated European and American society for over 300 years, yet it collapsed almost completely within a single generation when circumstances made women's natural strength more valuable than their artificial weakness. The speed of that collapse reveals something crucial. Oppressive systems that seem permanent and natural are often far more fragile than they appear. They depend on people continuing to believe in their necessity, and the moment that belief is seriously challenged, centuries of tradition can disappear virtually overnight. Dr. Ariel Levy, in her book Female Chauvinist Pigs, points out that modern women have more legal rights, educational opportunities, and economic independence than any generation in history. We have tools for recognizing and resisting manipulation that Victorian women never possessed. We have scientific knowledge about health and psychology that makes it impossible to believe many of the myths that sustained corseting culture. Most importantly, we have examples of women throughout history who chose to resist, who chose health over fashion, strength over submission, and authenticity over artificial perfection. Their stories prove that resistance is possible even under the most oppressive circumstances. The Victorian women who secretly loosened their stays, who shared survival strategies, who risked social ostracism to breathe freely. They were our ancestors in the struggle for bodily autonomy. Their courage in small daily acts of resistance paved the way for the larger transformations that eventually ended corseting culture entirely. And their example shows us what resistance looks like today. It's every woman who chooses comfort over fashion, who refuses to apologize for her natural body shape, who spends her time developing her capabilities rather than modifying her appearance, who questions beauty standards instead of automatically accepting them. The ultimate truth that our journey reveals is this: your body is not a project to be perfected, not a problem to be solved, not an object to be modified until it meets someone else's standards. Your body is the vessel for your life, your dreams, your achievements, and your connections with others. It deserves to be treated with respect, care, and appreciation for what it can do rather than criticism for how it appears. The Victorian women who died for 13-inch waists had the same intelligence, creativity and potential that you have. Their tragedy wasn't that they were weak or vain. Their tragedy was that they lived in a system that convinced them their natural bodies were shameful, and that their worth depended on their willingness to suffer for artificial standards. We don't have to repeat their mistakes. We can choose to value different things. We can choose to celebrate what our bodies can accomplish rather than obsessing over how they look. We can choose to support industries that enhance our capabilities rather than exploit our insecurities. The choice is ours, but only if we recognize that it is a choice. The first step toward freedom is understanding how unfreedom operates, recognizing the psychological techniques, economic interests, and social pressures that benefit from our self-doubt and body modification obsessions. Every time you take a deep breath without restriction, remember the women who couldn't. Every time you move freely through the world, honor the women who were confined by fashion. Every time you choose health over appearance, you're continuing the resistance that brave women began centuries ago. The corset may be gone, but the spirit that created it lives on in new forms. Recognizing those forms, questioning what seems natural, resisting what seems necessary, and choosing what serves your well-being over what serves others' profits. That's how we honor the women who suffered and died so that we might learn to choose differently. Your body is not your enemy. Your natural shape is not a problem to be solved. Your worth is not determined by your willingness to modify yourself to meet others' expectations. These truths seem obvious when stated clearly, but they're revolutionary in a culture that profits from your believing the opposite. The Victorian women who risked everything to breathe freely were fighting for your right to make different choices. The question is, what will you do with the freedom they helped make possible? Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darkest chapters of beautiful oppression. I hope their stories will stay with you, not as sources of despair about how little has changed, but as inspiration for recognizing your own power to choose health, strength, and authenticity over artificial standards that serve others' interests rather than your own well-being. If this story has moved you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is help others recognize that they're not alone in questioning standards that seem impossible to meet and practices that feel more like punishment than self-care. And please, stay tuned for our next journey together, because history is full of stories about people who chose courage over conformity, authenticity over artificial perfection, and freedom over the beautiful prisons that every generation builds for itself. Until then, breathe freely, move without restriction, and remember that your worth has nothing to do with your willingness to suffer for others' ideas about how you should look. Sweet dreams, and thank you for allowing me to share this important story with you.